Valen, Guardians of Hades romance series, written by Felicity Heaton, narrated by Eric G. Dove. Chapter 16. Escher stalked through the wet streets of Tokyo, the breeze cold against his cheeks but already carrying the scent of morning. Time was running out. He prowled around a corner and looked both ways along the intersection, his honed senses charting several blocks around him as he scoured them for his prey. Restless hunger gnawed at him, never sated and ever present. He growled through clenched teeth and then pulled down a slow breath, closed his eyes and focused, stilling his body to focus his mind. The black need abated but refused to leave him, still held him at its mercy and whispered seduction in his ear, words that promised retribution, satisfaction. He huffed and stepped, appearing on a rooftop above the intersection. The wind was stronger up high, whipping the tails of his long black cotton coat around his leather boots and the jeans he had tucked into them, filling the silence with the sound. He welcomed it, focused on it and his body and that black need, a hunger to destroy. He shifted foot to foot at the very edge of the roof, toes hanging over the drop, mind clear and focused, body honed and ready. Soon. The kill would be his soon. It would satisfy him enough that he could rest and regain his strength for the next night, for the next hunt. He eased back so his toes were on the edge of the skyscraper's roof and crouched, resting his elbows on his knees and allowing his hands to dangle between them as he waited. Waited. Minutes ticked past and mortals appeared, scurrying around below him like ants. He didn't care where they were going or where they had come from, or which of them was rushing to their death. For once, they weren't the target of his ever-present urge to kill. His usual need to make them suffer had been redirected, replaced by a consuming desire to locate the ones behind the attack on his brother Ares, the ones who wanted to open the gates, the ones who had tried to harm his family. His lips peeled back off his teeth, darkness bleeding through him as rain began to fall. He would find them, and they would pay for their sins. They would pay for trying to hurt the ones he loved. The wind picked up, rain lashed his face, and his coat fluttered behind him. He remained still, not moving a muscle and not feeling the cold as he scoured Tokyo with his acute senses, picking out every mortal within a mile radius. The bright lights and neon shone up from the streets all around him, all across the vast city. He lifted his head and scanned the panorama, studying it. To his left, Tokyo Tower speared the sky, bright orange against its backdrop of the business district and the river. On his right, a dark swath in the middle of too much light called to him like a beacon, a pocket of nature that surrounded the castle of the emperor. Back when he and his brothers had first arrived, much of Tokyo had been open space, filled with traditional wooden structures. There had been peace. Now there was too much noise. He gritted his teeth. It grated on him, pushing at his control and made him want to either leave or destroy everything in his wake. Yet somehow he remained, and the city remained with him. It flickered to the other world in the rain haze, a city bathed in flames and fighting for survival. Rain fell as streaks of fire, and the building beneath him creaked and groaned, the section to his left torn away, to leave only twisted metal and chunks of broken concrete that looked as if a huge demon had ripped it in two. Blue fire dashed across the dark park, chasing something. Screams rose up from far below him, the terrified shrieks of mortals combining with the roars of demons to ring like music in his ears. Gods. He wanted them to suffer like that, because they deserved it. Despicable monsters, all of them, both demon and mortal alike. Tokyo flickered back to the present, rain-swept and quiet. The tower glowed to his left, the park beckoned to his right. Behind him, the air vibrated with the power of the gate. He held it open as he had every night over the past 3 months, the lure for the demons. So far, none had dared to approach it, but they would. He could feel it in his bones, could sense it in nature as she whispered to him. The demons were coming. Soon he would have the fight he wanted, the battle he needed, and the blood on his hands that he craved. Soon. But not tonight. The only creatures foolish enough to be near him were the mortals below, scurrying around beneath their cheap convenience store umbrellas, absorbed in their lives and ignorant of others, ignorant of the damage they did. Escher looked back at the gate, water rolling off the longer lengths of his black hair and soaking into the pale blue scarf he wore wrapped around his neck. The colorful concentric rings hovered in a disk flat above the rooftop of the skyscraper, flaring in places as they turned inside each other, twisting in opposite directions. Impatient, like him. They wanted a purpose, a reason for being here in this world. He had none to give them. The symbols between the bands of the circle shimmered in different colors, and he closed his eyes, allowing their power to soothe him as they connected him back to the underworld, to the only world he cared about. He turned away from the gate and watched the mortals passing below him. He despised this world and the foul creatures who inhabited it. Barely a century ago, the gate had been at ground level like the ones his brothers protected around the world, but the mortals in Tokyo had built and built, never stopping, destroying everything in their path and pushing nature out. It seemed to him that they only knew how to destroy. They only thought of themselves. He pushed the sleeve of his black coat back and stroked his wrist, not feeling the obsidian-woven band that encircled it. He only felt the scars. They burned beneath his cold fingers, irritating him, and he scratched at the band, sneered as he glared down at the mortals below him, beneath him. Humans. He growled through his teeth and tracked them one by one, the darkness rising inside him, writhing and spreading black tendrils through his body, its grip on him growing stronger. His blue eyes darted between the mortals and short fangs pressed against his lower teeth as he ground them together. They wanted to destroy everything, especially when they didn't understand it, especially if it was stronger than they were. The rain around him stopped falling, droplets suspended in the night air, shimmering like colorful pearls as they caught the lights of the gate behind him. He stared at them, breathed hard, and fought to calm himself, chanting in his head in the language of his home, the only world he cared about, the only world that cared about him. His fingers rubbed harder, digging into his wrists, and pain built there, fire that licked at his flesh and seared his bones, and he looked down, catching a glimpse of blood before it disappeared, leaving only scars behind. He growled, and the water he held in the air around him vibrated, trembling as if it feared him. It had nothing to fear. Water was his passion, his companion, his most precious thing. It was the only thing that was good about this wretched world. His powers had grown stronger, giving him control over more than water, placing any liquid under his command. But it was the water he loved, and it was the water he controlled. It was abundant here, flowed in so many forms: rivers, seas, rain, tears. A component of every living thing, a weapon he could use against them. He dropped his focus to a lone male as they crossed the road and walked along the pedestrian street opposite him. Escher narrowed his gaze on the human as the noises of their world broke through the silence of the rain and reached his ears, scratching in them. Car horns blaring, engines roaring, traffic crossings speaking as they stopped those cars, and mortals twittering to each other as they used them. The rain suspended around him began to shake. His mother's voice whispered in his mind, a soothing melody that had him reaching for the pocket of his dark gray shirt. "Whenever it becomes too much, my beloved, find your peace." He pulled the tiny black noise-canceling earbuds from it and pushed them in his left ear and then his right, and let the strings of the classical piece wash over him. She had said other things when she had given him the gift, things he hadn't bothered to put to memory, because they had been about the mortals, about learning to forgive and to love humans again. Impossible. He would never love a human. It was bad enough that a mortal, a carrier, had dared to invade his family and steal Ares' heart. Now a second brother had been targeted by one of their vicious, deceptive kind. If that mortal dared to harm Valen, he focused his power. The water around him exploded. She would pay for it with her own blood. Chapter 17. Ava started awake, her heart lodged in her throat, head spinning and pulse racing. She blinked hard, and a tremble started deep in her core. What had happened? She fought to remember. The shaking racking her tired, aching body grew violent as an image came to her. Benares. Only he hadn't been the Benares with the playgirl good looks and sultry smile, oozing charm and seductive promises. He had been a monster. He loomed over her, his arm a tight band across her back, glowing white-blue eyes surrounded by obsidian streaked with equally bright lightning that blazed outwards from them, and black lips moving soundlessly, flashing sharp teeth. A monster with hunger in his eyes. Ava shook so hard that she struggled to push the cream covers off her body. Tears filled her eyes, making it hard to see, and she blinked them away only to have more replace them. They tumbled down her cheeks as she ghosted her hands over her bare legs and her hips, searching for marks, searching for something that would confirm her worst fears. Bile rose in her throat, and she swallowed it down as she reached her stomach, sobs shaking her even as she fought them back and tried to deny them. She didn't remember undressing. She remembered the hot feel of his mouth on hers, remembered hitting him and him striking back. She lifted a trembling hand and winced as her fingers made contact with the left side of her head. She remembered hitting the arm of the couch on the way down, and then Benares looming over her. Cold froze her blood in her veins and wouldn't thaw, no matter how many times she told herself that he hadn't touched her. She couldn't convince herself, because she wasn't sure. He had wanted her, and she had been at his mercy. He was a monster, something from a different world, from hell. God. She pulled her knees to her chest and rocked as she tried to shut out the image of him, but it was branded on her mind, taunting her with the truth. Benares was a monster. She shuddered and buried her face in her knees as she finally heard his words. He wanted to feed on her. She wasn't sure what that meant or whether he had done it. She wasn't sure of anything anymore. No, she was sure of one thing. She had to get away. Ava rolled from the bed and gathered her clothes from the wooden floor, pulling them on with trembling fingers. She gave up trying to button her jeans and zip her boots and fumbled with the black t-shirt. Tears blurred her vision again, and she blinked them away as she crawled across the room, fear giving way to determination as her instinct to survive took over. The floor squeaked beneath her, filling the heavy silence together with her panted breaths. She reached the doors that covered the left half of the far wall of the room, next to the kitchen, and pulled her phone from her jeans. Her fingers shook so violently as she opened the case and slipped the key out of the pocket in it that she almost dropped it. It took her several attempts to slot the key into the lock on the door and turn it. Relief poured through her when she heard the latch click. She hastily pulled the doors open. It was dark on the other side, but she didn't need to see to know where her kit bag would be. She grabbed the black duffel and pulled it out of the cupboard, and felt it to reassure herself there were weapons inside. Everything she needed was in it: money, clothes, false identities. Ava tugged it to the kitchen and used one of the stools to pull herself onto her unsteady feet. Her legs threatened to give out, but she locked her knees and shoved fear to the back of her mind. She could break down later, once she had escaped this madness. The air shifted behind her. The wooden floor creaked. Ava screamed and swung her duffel, hit the person hard enough to make them grunt and crumple to the floor. She bolted for the door, grabbing the first set of car keys on her way past the bowl on the kitchen island counter where she kept them, and a black padded jacket from the hook near the door. She yanked the door open and ran down the stairs of the building, refusing to slow even as her boots flapped around her ankles. She lost one at a bend in the staircase, kicked the other off, and kept running. She hit the door to the building with such force that it slammed against the wall as it opened, the loud crack echoing around the courtyard like a gunshot. Ava frantically pressed the button on the car keys, blood racing so hard her head spun. The lights on her Fiat 500 flashed and she grimaced. She just had to pick the keys for the slowest damn car in her collection. She opened the door of the compact white car, threw her bag and coat onto the passenger seat, and shoved the key into the slot. The engine started with a reassuring purr. She had to run. She had to escape. Ava put the car into gear and flicked on the headlights. Her gasp shattered the silence. Valen stood between her and the exit. "Don't leave," he shouted. Hurt flashed in his eyes, but she was focused elsewhere. on the arcs of white-purple lightning that crackled over his hands. He was a monster, too. They were all monsters. She gunned the engine. His hand rose, palm facing her, a gesture for her to stop, to do as he bid. She shook her head again. She couldn't. She had to run. He would move. He would move or she would run him over. She had to get away. She needed to escape this madness. She needed to escape before it swallowed her whole and there was nothing left of her. Her bare foot hit the gas pedal. Move. She stared, eyes widening as the car lunged toward him. Move. She willed him to do it because she couldn't stop. Her body wouldn't listen now. She needed to run before Benares found her. Because Benares had... I said don't leave. Valen's voice crashed into her head, knocking that terrifying thought out of it. His hand curled into a fist and he slammed it down into the car bonnet. The back wheels lifted off the ground as the front of the Fiat crumpled under the blow. Her eyes nearly popped out of her head. She shrieked as the lights on the dashboard and the headlights flickered, and arcs of electricity chased over the chassis and up his arm. His eyes glowed bright gold. The engine stuttered and died. Her panted gasps filled the silence as she stared at him. What in God's name was he? A quiet voice at the back of her mind whispered that she knew what he was. A monster just like Benares. Another voice issued from her chest, trying to push the first away, telling her that was a lie. He was nothing like Benares. Even when she had denied it, some part of her had been aware that Valen was different, that the things she had seen him do were real, and that he had powers. That had frightened her, but he hadn't. He had been gentle with her. He had looked at her with something akin to affection in his eyes, a feeling she had only seen him reveal to his mother, and had kept hidden from his brothers and the rest of the world. His fingers flexed, and he looked down at his right hand, drawing her attention there. Blood ran down it, but it was the sparks that chased up his arm, crackling and snapping against his skin, that held her attention. He wasn't a monster, but he wasn't a man either. Her panic slowly subsided, but fear remained, its grip on her so fierce she couldn't shake it. She could only fight it and the images of Benares it kept throwing at her, piecing them together in a way that made her feel he had done something to her, violated her. Tears filled her eyes. Her hand shook against the steering wheel. Her foot still pressed the dead accelerator down. The headlights flickered, and a bright bolt of electricity leaped from the bonnet and hit Valen's hand, and chased around his arm. He didn't even flinch. He sauntered over to the driver's door and opened it. "I'll explain later, but right now you're the one who is going to do some explaining," he snarled, and she had half a mind to say that was her line. That aching mind fixated on the first part of what he had said, because the rest confused the hell out of her. Was he going to explain about what she had just seen him do, and the whole crazy parallel world she had fallen into? She hoped so. She had seen him total a bar, had seen his brothers pop out of thin air, and seen him disappear in the same manner, and now he had stopped her car with one hand. That hand caught her arm, and he dragged her from the car, and then reached in and snatched her bag and coat. She stumbled as he pulled her towards the gate, and she saw the front of the Fiat. It was wrecked. The white metal twisted and caved in where he had struck it with his fist. Impossible. Her knees gave out. His strong hand on her waist steadied her, and a quiet thrill chased through her. A blush touched her cheeks as flashes of the times they had been together filled her mind, bursting into existence for a heartbeat before returning to the darkness. Memories of Valen became memories of Benares, and panic lanced her. She pulled away from him, for a moment seeing Benares holding her. When she blinked, the vision disappeared, leaving Valen behind. His golden eyes gained an edge of hurt as he slung the strap of her bag over his shoulder, and he grabbed her arm again, tugging her roughly towards the gate. She stared at the front of her car, and then at his hand on her arm, and fear gave way to anger, an emotion she knew how to deal with. She twisted free of his grip, and he looked back at her. "What the fuck are you?" She didn't mean it to come out so blunt, so harsh, but the words flew from her lips, fueled by rage that shot her temper straight into the red. He flexed his hand again, making the muscles in his forearm ripple with hidden strength, and reached for her. "I said I would explain later. After you've explained yourself. After she had explained herself. She frowned at him, head pounding, stomach twisting into knots as she struggled to make sense of that and everything that was happening to her. Come, he barked, a sharp edge to his usually mellow, deep voice. He was angry with her. He walked a few steps toward the door set into the huge arched gate and looked back at her, his eyes narrowing and eyebrows dropping low above them when he saw she hadn't moved. I'm not going anywhere with you. I don't know what's going on anymore, and I want out. I'm tired of this. I'm tired of everything. I'm just tired. I bet you are, he snapped and muttered something beneath his breath. What the hell is that supposed to mean? If he was trying to make her angry, he was pressing all the right buttons. What had she done to upset him, other than hit him with a bag, run away from him, and attempt to run him down with her car? We must leave here. Come and I will explain. He held his hand out to her again, his eyes bright golden pools of danger that shook her to her core along with that one word. She wished he would stop saying it. Heat pooled at the apex of her thighs whenever he told her to come, memories of their time filling her head and her heart. But on the heels of that fire came ice that chilled her to the bone and conjured images of Benares. No. She mimicked his empty tone, bone-deep tired of being ordered around and left in the dark, tired of being afraid. Her strength was flowing from her now that she had stopped, now that Valen was here. She wanted to collapse into a heap and break down just as she had promised herself she could. It wasn't like her, and she didn't like it. She didn't like feeling this weak, this vulnerable, when she was used to being strong and in control. She wrapped her arms around herself, squeezed hard, and tried to hold herself together. I can't do this anymore, she whispered. I'm so tired. His face darkened and his words lashed at her, tearing through her fragile defenses. I guess it must get tiring fucking every guy you meet. But we can talk about that later. Right now, I need to get you to safety. She stared at him, reeling from that blow, ears ringing from the hard hit. Fucking every guy she met. Her eyes slowly widened as the meaning behind that sank in. There was only one way he could have known about what had happened at the meeting, and that was if Jin had gone to see Valen. What had that bitch said to poison Valen against her? Or was it not what Jin had said, but what she had done? Benares's deep voice echoed in her mind, sending pain shooting through her chest. His sister had gone out to feed. Had Valen fallen for Jin's charms when she had somehow resisted Benares? Had she resisted Benares? The blood in her veins chilled, and she could almost feel the heat draining from her as she stared up into Valen's eyes. They were dark and hard, as cold as her blood. He honestly believed she had slept with another man, that she would do such a thing. Had she? Ava turned her face away from him, looking off to her right, into the shadowy corner at the side of the courtyard, her eyes stinging and heart pounding as she fought to pull herself together and find her feet again. Valen unleashed a low growl. He grabbed her arm and yanked her to him, his action so rough she flinched as pain bloomed in her shoulder. His touch softened and she flinched for a different reason, when he brushed the fingers of his other hand over the left side of her head. It throbbed, hot and pounding in time with her pulse, sending waves of sickening pain rolling over her skull. What the fuck happened? He snarled, and she felt his eyes leap to her face, their familiar burn demanding she look at him. She couldn't. Not when she was falling apart all over again, torn to pieces by his question. I don't know, she whispered, and the trembling started again, so badly this time that she felt sure her knees would give out. Tears blurred her vision. She shook her head as she tried to find the answer, and those tears skated down her cheeks, hot against her skin. He growled again, a sound that should have frightened her, fit for a monster. But she felt no fear as he inspected the cut on her temple, his touch light and gentle, his anger visible in the trembling grip he had on her arm. He was no longer angry with her. He was angry for her. And she was stupid because it brought more tears to her eyes. She rubbed them away, not wanting to cry over something as trivial as him being angry about what had happened to her, even when he was the first man to do that for her. He was the first to stand in her corner and want to fight for her, to avenge and protect her. It was so tempting to surrender and rely on him like that, to let everything that had happened consume her, destroy her. But she couldn't. She was stronger than this. "I'm going to kill the bastard," he bit out, and his fingers shook against her skin. She slowly lifted her eyes to his, wanting to see that fury shining in them, turning them molten gold, needing to see it. His irises burned brightly, glowing in the low light. But he wasn't a monster. He wasn't like Benares. The fury blazing in his eyes turned to rage as they narrowed on other parts of her face and her neck, and then settled on her split lip. "I'm going to fucking kill him." He went to pull away, but she seized hold of his arm, fear sending a cold blast through her and her heart screaming at her to stop him. Not because she was afraid Benares would hurt him, but because she didn't want him to leave. She didn't want to be alone. He stilled, strain written across his handsome face, a war erupting in his eyes, telling her how deeply he wanted to avenge her, but also how deeply he wanted to stay as she had silently asked. He slowly sobered, the rage in his gold eyes dropping from a boil to a simmer, but not leaving them. He had it under control, but it would only take a spark to light it up again. "Did he?" He clenched his fist, and the muscle in his jaw popped. Ava swallowed hard and shook her head, but she could only move it a fraction of a degree as uncertainty racked her. "I don't think so." "You don't think so?" he snapped, his voice loud in the courtyard, that rage rolling back to a boil in his eyes. I'm not sure." Tears streaked down her cheeks. "I hit my head. I passed out." Her knees finally gave out. Valen caught her and pulled her into his arms. "Nothing happened," he whispered into her hair and stroked her back, his caress soothing her ragged nerves and helping to clear her head, driving out the fear that controlled her and allowing her to focus. "If Jinn is a succubus, I'm guessing this Benares bastard is an incubus, and he wouldn't. It isn't in his nature to feed that way." She nodded against his chest, even though she didn't have a damn clue what he was talking about. Succubus? Incubus? They were just myths, weren't they? Legends of demons made up by people hundreds of years ago. Was Valen telling the truth, or was he just saying whatever she needed to hear to put her mind at ease? She drew back to look into his eyes and search for the answer there. The courtyard spun as if someone had tossed them into a blender and darkness engulfed her. It parted a moment later, but everything kept spinning around her. She gripped Valen's arms, digging her fingers into his biceps. Her vision stopped whirling, but her stomach was slow to follow, still turning and twirling so violently she feared she would throw up. Valen pulled her against him, his hand pressing into the back of her head and pinning it to his hard chest. His t-shirt was soft against her cheek, his body warm and his embrace comforting. She sank into it, letting him be strong for her. Another first. She had never allowed anyone to do such a thing before. She had never relied on anyone the way she was coming to rely on him. He sifted his fingers through her hair, and God, it was soothing, filled her with warmth and light that banished the cold and the darkness. How did he do this to her? She wanted to draw back and look at him, seeking an answer to that question this time. But she didn't have the strength to move, because she didn't want this to end. She wanted him to keep holding her like this, maybe forever. "Be quiet," he murmured against her hair, and she frowned, hadn't realized she was making any noise. A low growl echoed around her. It didn't come from him this time. She had the sudden sensation that they weren't alone. "Right now, I need to get you to safety." Valen had come to her because she was in danger. Her heart started like a jackhammer against her ribs. In danger from what? Was it Benares? Panic sank its claws into her again, and she pushed her palms against Valen's chest, shoving him back as a need to run surged through her. He clucked his tongue and grabbed her as she backed off, his large hand locking tightly around her wrist. Her left foot hit thin air. Her eyes zipped to the courtyard far below her, and her vision wobbled. Her cars and the smoldering wreck of the Fiat zooming towards her and away again. She opened her mouth to scream at Valen about the fact he had almost killed her by teleporting her to the edge of the pitched roof rather than the apex of it, but her voice died as the courtyard below her stopped doing strange things in her vision. Cold stole through every inch of her. It wasn't Benares. She stared, numb all over, at the things crawling around below her. Some sort of creature. There were 4 of them, resembling something between a man and a dog, their elongated limbs making it impossible for her to fool herself into thinking they were one or the other. They snapped and snarled whenever they came too close to each other, their sleek black bodies bristling with aggression and shimmering ethereally under the slim light, iridescent like a beetle's armor. Valen slowly pulled her back towards him, drawing her focus back to the fact she was dangling perilously above them. He eased back up the slope, boots silent on the terracotta tiles. Ava peered down at the monsters. "What are they?" she whispered. 2 of them looked up. Ava shot backwards, bumping into Valen's chest, her hand clamping down over her mouth. She breathed hard, fought to slow it in case they heard her and came after her. Their blue glowing eyes hovered in her mind, sending fear trickling through her numb body, drawing an image of Benares to the surface of her mind. "He's on to you," Valen whispered and caught her arm. Benares had sent the monsters? She looked back at Valen, believing him for a moment, but then another reason for Benares sending demonic creatures after her dawned on her. It was another ploy. It was a trick to make Valen fall deeper under her spell so she could bring him to them. Valen had been quick to save her, and her wounds had drawn out his softer side. Had that been part of the plan too? She shuddered. No. Benares had wanted to seduce her. He had wanted to feed on her. If there were such things as incubi and he was one, then feeding was a sexual thing. She glanced back at Valen. Had Jinn fed from him? She hated herself for asking that question, and for the tiny seed of doubt it planted in her heart. "We need to move again." He pulled her back against him. "Wait." Her stomach did a violent lurch at the thought of teleporting, and she shook her head. If he dragged her through that dark twisting and turning space again, she was definitely going to vomit. It wasn't a request. He wrapped his arms around her. Someone put the world into a blender again. Chapter 18. Ava kept her eyes squeezed shut as her head kept spinning long after her feet had hit solid ground. Thankfully, Valen kept hold of her, his hands firm against her side and back. "Ava," he whispered, and she didn't want to open her eyes, not even when his voice was so coaxing and soft, luring her out of the darkness and making her want to see him, so she could see how he looked when he spoke to her like that. One hand left her. She clamped her hands down on his arms, pressing her fingertips in hard, afraid she might collapse. He made a soft snorting sound that echoed with amusement and feathered his fingers across her cheek. "You can come out now." She knew that. She just wasn't sure it was a wise idea. She was stronger than this. Ava sucked down a breath that went no way towards steadying her trembling body, lifted her head towards his, and slowly opened her eyes. He smiled down at her. Black wisps of smoke curled around his shoulders, framing him, and her eyes widened when she dropped them and found similar onyx ribbons twining around her arms. Her stomach rebelled. Ava shoved out of his arms, almost fell as she twisted away from him, but managed to remain upright somehow, and ran down the wood-paneled corridor that led to the bathroom. She hit the door hard with the flat of her hand, sending it slamming against the white tiles, and skidded to her knees in front of the toilet. "Having a moment there?" The teasing male voice came from the other room just as she threw up. "Bite me." Valen's reply had more venom than a cobra. She hadn't realized they weren't alone. It didn't stop her stomach from lurching. Ava gripped the toilet bowl and threw up again. "Are you okay?" A female voice this time. Megan. Hell, she was glad it hadn't been one of the men or Valen who had come to check on her. She nodded and groaned, her cheeks heating as shame swept through her. There went her reputation. Everyone in the other room would always see her as a woman with a weak stomach, a fragile constitution, and not the assassin she really was. Ava pulled herself up onto her feet, flushed the toilet, and turned towards the sink. She kept her gaze firmly away from the mirror, unable to face her reflection when embarrassment scalded her cheeks. She twisted the cold tap, bent over, and splashed water on her face. It was refreshing, soothing more than just her burning cheeks. "It takes a little getting used to," Megan continued, and Ava glanced across at the brunette as she moved, pushing her shoulder-length hair out of her face. Her dark eyes were bright, shining with amusement and affection. She glowed. Was it her relationship with Aries that made her glow like that? "It took me at least 20 times. Ava groaned. 20? "I don't think I can handle one more, let alone another 17 or so." She hung her head forwards and watched the water roll down the strands of her black and blue hair as she waited for her stomach to finally settle. Megan seemed so happy with Aries. He had powers like Valen, and a temper to match, judging by what she had seen of him. But Megan was with him, unafraid of him. Happy. Could she really be like that with Valen? She stilled and watched the water swirling down the drain. Could she? "Megan," she started, and froze when she looked across at the woman and spotted Valen standing behind her, a dark shadow against Megan's crimson jumper and blue jeans. Ava's cheeks heated to 1,000 degrees again, heart pounding a staccato rhythm, as she stared at him, and the question she had been about to ask right in front of him rang around her head. "Do you think Valen likes me romantically?" He frowned at her and then looked himself over as if he thought she saw something wrong with him, and that was the reason she had frozen solid. God, what was wrong with her? What was it about Valen that had her so backwards about being forwards? She liked him. That was the problem. She had never been shy around men before because they had never made her feel the way Valen did. They had never made her feel. Could he like her the way she liked him? He blinked, seemed to snap himself out of whatever thoughts were running around his head, and glared at Megan. She rolled her eyes and walked away, leaving them alone. Could he? Sure, he seemed to enjoy her company, looked at her with heat in his eyes, and wanted her. But was it more than that? She couldn't ask him outright. If she did, there was a chance he would crush her, and she was tired of being weak. There had to be a way for her to tell whether those feelings she caught glimpses of in his eyes at times were real. He held his hand up. Her gaze leaped to it. Lemonade. He averted his gaze, staring at the running sink tap. "I saw it on TV once." He shoved the can of lemonade towards her, a hint of rose climbing onto his cheeks. "You had a shock." When she didn't take it, he looked positively mortified. "Shit, I got it wrong. I thought a sugary drink was good in this situation." God, he was adorable. He went to take his hand back. Ava placed hers over the can, stopping him in his tracks. The blush on his cheeks grew darker as he stared at their hands. The second she took the can, he snatched his hand back and rubbed the nape of his neck, and then jammed both of his hands into the pockets of his black combat trousers. "Thank you," she said. He blushed harder and turned his back on her. "No big deal." But it was. With a single action, he had revealed himself to her, letting her see past the barriers and catch more than just a glimpse of his feelings. He cared about her. She cracked the can open and his head whipped around, eyes darting to her hands. "You're going to drink it?" Ava laughed, the sound out of place in the midst of her tumultuous feelings, making her feel she really had lost her mind. "What did you expect me to do with it?" He shrugged, rolling those toned shoulders beneath his black t-shirt, pushing all of her fears even further away as he drew all of her focus to him. She sipped the drink and managed a smile for him. "You did get it right. Sugar for shock." Her voice lost all the warmth she had tried to put into it, and she stared down at her can of lemonade, the reason for him giving it to her sweeping back in to overwhelm her. "He wouldn't have," Valen whispered and stepped into the room. He hesitated and then placed his hands on her upper arms, and she looked up at him, right into his eyes, seeing the belief in them. "Incubi feed on pleasure. If he knocked you out..." He ground his teeth, and she could see he was finding this as difficult to talk about as she was. She nodded, letting him know he didn't need to finish. She knew what he was saying. Benares wouldn't have received any nourishment from violating her, and feeding had been his objective, although part of her still feared that the other reason he'd had for wanting her might have driven him to do things while she had been unconscious. Jealousy. He wanted to take her from Valen. She sipped the drink again and felt better as some of her strength began to return. Valen placed his palm against her left cheek and brushed the pad of his thumb across her lower lip, his golden gaze locked on it, darkening by degrees as he stared at the cut that darted over it. "I'm going to kill the bastard," he murmured, and his irises brightened, the softer emotions melting away under the heat of his rage. It touched her that he wanted to protect her, but it fueled the feeling that had been lurking in the pit of her stomach, gnawing at her for days. Damn guilt. "Valen!" Ares called from the other room. Valen went to turn away from her. Ava caught his left wrist. "I've been an arse," she blurted, and he frowned over his shoulder at her. She tried to look him in the eye, but hers refused to lift above his shoulders, so she stared at his throat as he turned back to face her. His head lowered, bringing his square chin and the wicked curve of his lower lip into view, and she knew he was looking at her hand where it held his arm, waiting for her to explain. "I've been an arse," she said again, thinking this time she would be able to get the rest of the words jammed in her throat out into the open. No. They remained lodged there, and the longer he stared at her hand, the more fiercely they resisted her. She swallowed and squeezed her eyes shut. She was stronger than this. She had already told him in a way, so she wasn't sure why admitting it was so difficult. He needed to hear her say it, and she needed it out there to alleviate the guilt eating away at her. She opened her eyes, forced them to meet his, and shoved the words out. "Our first time together blew my mind." He stared at her, too sober for her liking, completely unreadable. Her stupid heart started pounding again. He had to say something. A glimmer of something warm lit his eyes, and then he grinned. "It blew your mind so hard you forgot it, huh?" She barely heard the words, was too entranced by the sight of him smiling at her. Really smiling. There was nothing forced about it, nothing false. She had made him smile. She had the feeling that smiling like this was rare for him, and she should cherish it. "Don't sweat it," he said. She thought he would pull away and go to his brother's, but he pulled her into his arms instead and captured her mouth in a fierce kiss, demanding and delicious, one that melted her. She leaned into it, sought more of it, unwilling to let him give this to her and then steal it away before she was ready. He moaned and angled his head and kissed her deeper, claiming all of her. The stud in his tongue stroked over hers, and she shivered in his arms as a thrill chased through her, memories of how good it had felt against her flesh igniting her desire. Valen pulled back and pressed his forehead and nose against hers, his panted breaths matching hers as he held her. "Next time, I'll try to blow your mind so hard you forget your name." Heat flashed over her skin at just the thought. "I like the sound of that." He jerked back, surprise widening his eyes before they narrowed on her, blazing with heat and a dark hunger, a need that she knew he saw reflected in her eyes. "Valen!" Someone barked, and he flinched, turned cold eyes toward the corridor, and glared in the direction of the living room. The haze of the kiss gave way to the cold that had filled her when she had figured out Benares's plan, and she tightened her grip on Valen's arm, holding him in place and stopping him from going to his brother's. She had to tell him. He wouldn't like it, would be upset with her for saying it, because he was like her in so many respects and didn't want her to view him as weak. She didn't. He was strong. But he was vulnerable, and it was his family that made him that way. So before she allowed him to go into the other room and face that family, she needed to make sure he was aware of Benares's plan. She needed to protect him in the only way she could. She had to tell him her theory, whether he wanted to hear it or not. Chapter 19. "I don't think Benares is on to me. I don't think he sent those monsters to kill me. He did it because he knew you would rush in to protect me, because he wants you deeper under my spell." Ava glanced away from him, sighed, and then lifted her eyes back to meet his. "Benares plans to turn you to his side. I'm supposed to bring you to him in 3 days. He's using me as a way to lure you over." The rage burning in Valen's veins, the black need to find Benares and rip him into tiny pieces, stood up to the ice that assaulted him as Ava's words sank in. But it wasn't long before the cold was winning, vanquishing the fire, making him numb. He stared down into her beautiful blue eyes, saw the truth shimmering in them as they revealed her fear and her worry, and how much she hated having to tell him this because she knew it would hurt him. Her grip on his arm tightened. Her hand shook against him. He glanced down at it, not feeling anything as he silently fought the mocking voice ringing in his mind, laughing at him. Benares had targeted him for one reason. The bastard thought he was the weak link. Feeling began to seep back in, emotions born of the darker side of his blood. Benares dared to insult him? He ground his teeth and growled through them, filled with a need to deny that he was vulnerable, to show Ava that he was anything but weak. He was strong. She hesitated, the concern in her eyes growing as she stood before him in the bathroom, clearly unsure what to say. An urge to head out into the night, find Benares and destroy him replaced the one to make her see that he was strong. It whispered seductive words in his ears, bid him to listen to it and surrender. He planted his boots to the floor and refused. If he went after Benares now, the bastard might think that Ava had told him about his plan, and might send someone after her. The thought of her being at Jin's mercy, or that of those fell beasts Benares had called forth from some dark corner of this world, left him cold to his marrow. But he had to do something. He needed to show that he was strong. He was. Ava slipped out of focus as he sank into his thoughts, easily consumed by them and the emotions running riot inside him. He had always viewed himself as strong, one of the strongest in the group. Realizing that he might have been wrong about something that felt like such a fundamental part of himself was crushing, to say the very least. He couldn't accept it, even when he knew it was true. He even had to admire the bastard for coming up with this plan. He and his brothers were strongest when they were a united force, an army of gods. The worst of it wasn't the enemy who had placed them into this position, on the brink of being turned against each other. Not really. It had been him. Gods. He was a massive dick. The enemy were only attempting to accelerate what he had already started. He had been slowly driving a wedge between him and his brothers, gradually pushing them away and separating himself from them since Calendria had died, since Zeus had taken away his favor. He pressed his fingers to the scar on the left side of his face. They shook, but nothing he did steadied them, not when the ground was tilting and bucking beneath his feet, about to give out. "Valen." Ava's soft voice reached his ears, and he blinked himself back to her, stared down at her where she stood in front of him, closer to him than before. He caught the apology in her tropical blue eyes before she dropped them to his chest. Valen reached out to touch her. She beat him to it, lifting her hand a second before she raised her eyes back to his, and placing it over his, against his scar. "I know," she whispered, so much feeling behind those two simple words, feeling that seemed to reach into his chest and squeeze his heart. She cast her gaze down again, sighed, and bravely met his eyes once more. "I know the path you're taking. I've pushed away everyone I ever cared about, family included. Part of me did it because I was angry with some of them, because I thought I hated them, and part of me did it to protect the others. I was so angry, with my father for how he treated and betrayed my mother, and my brother for following in his footsteps and siding with him. I was even angry with my mother for being so weak. That anger led me to a dark place, Valen, a place where I turned against the world, where I became little more than a weapon for hire." She did look away from him now, her gaze locking on the tiled floor, and that heart she had squeezed went out to her, but it warmed at the same time as awareness of what she was trying to do steadily filled him. She was trying to make him feel better by revealing that they weren't so different, that she knew his pain and the darkness he faced, and that was why she needed to stop him from making the same mistake she had. Her confession was more than all that, though. There was a deeper meaning behind it, and that was what touched him. She had told him without words that she understood him, that she had seen this side of him and she wasn't going to walk away. It hadn't changed how she felt, whatever the fuck that was. He wasn't going to probe into it right now, when she was afraid to look at him, because she had revealed her vulnerable side in order to make him feel better about his own. She would bolt. Neither of them liked being vulnerable. Both of them reacted badly to it, liable to lash out to protect themselves. He wouldn't press her. For once, he was going to do the opposite to what he wanted without protest or being forced. He shifted his hand, moving it out from beneath hers, and pressed it to the back of her one, bringing her palm into contact with his face. He held it there, absorbing her warmth as he studied her, and what the hell they were doing, searching for an answer. He could only draw one conclusion, and it rocked him to his soul. His mother had been right. There was a woman who had been made just for him. That woman's name was Ava. "I might vomit." Diamond's deep voice cut into the moment like a knife, slicing it in two, and Valen shifted his gaze to his left, to his brother, and glared at the bastard, leaving him in no doubt of the pain he was about to suffer for interrupting them. "Your stomach must be weaker than mine." Ava lowered her hand from Valen's face, a snap to her tone. Diamond scowled at her, his pale blue eyes shimmering dangerously. Valen chalked it up as a victory for her, and ran his eyes over her curves as she walked away from him, a sway to her hips that exuded confidence and that warrior air he found so damn appealing about her. "Be my guest." He gestured towards the toilet, would have shoved his brother in its direction if this had been the underworld, where Diamond's power wasn't liable to give him frostbite as a reward for touching him. Diamond growled, his white eyebrows dipping low above his glittering pale eyes, but Valen wasn't listening. He followed Ava in a daze, transfixed by the difference in her, how she had gone from warm and tender to cold and hard in a heartbeat, not allowing Diamond to see that softer side of her. Mine. That side of her was for his eyes only, belonged to him and him alone. She stopped in the living room, sank into his black leather couch at the end nearest her duffel bag where it rested on the terracotta-tiled floor, and kicked her feet up on the wooden coffee table. They were bare, their soles dirty, and he barely stopped himself from going into his bedroom and finding her a pair of socks to keep her feet warm. When had he gone from warrior to woman? He wasn't going to turn into Ares, castrated by his love for Megan, reduced to following her around like a puppy, looking at her as if she was the light of his life, his sole reason for living, and he would do anything for her, whatever she commanded, even get her socks. Ava looked up at him and he realized he had been staring down at her, stood beside the couch like a dolt and probably looking as goofy and moon-eyed as Ares. Gods, it was too late for him. She had already castrated him. Her lips curved into a faint smile. Warmth bloomed in his chest. He scowled at her, and that faint smile became a full-blown one. "Message received." She winked at him, teasing him now. Just how well could she read him? How in tune were they? "What have you discovered?" Karras said from his spot in Valen's favorite black wingback armchair near the fireplace, his softly spiked short black hair, long coat, shirt, and trousers making him blend into it. Karras absently twisted the silver band on his left thumb around it. His brother played with that ring so much, Valen was surprised he hadn't worn it down to nothing over the past few centuries. He would have if it had been made of any other material, but it had been forged from the metal of the gods on Mount Olympus. A gift designed to last an eternity. Like the feelings behind it? Valen had never grown balls big enough to ask that question, or dare to see what Karras would do if it went missing, even though he was beyond curious. Level a city, probably. Possibly the entire planet. That ring probably meant more to his older brother than anything else, family included. Karras's green eyes turned wary as they shifted from him to Ava. His big brother had no reason to fear her. She was as mortal as they came, near powerless against them. and for once she wasn't armed. Concern flared in Karis's eyes. Gone so fast, Valen thought he had imagined it at first. Karis looked as if he wanted to say something but was struggling with it, which meant one thing. Valen hadn't imagined that concern, and Karis wanted to apologize. His big brother had always been awkward about such things. Valen wasn't much better at it. He blamed their father. Hades wasn't good with apologies either. Persephone did all the apologizing for him. Valen shrugged, shooting for casual, an attempt to let his brother know it was no big deal, and he didn't have to apologize for chewing him out when he had done nothing wrong. Correction. He had done something wrong. He had let Karis say those things without defending himself. They were both at fault, so he couldn't hold Karis to blame. Not entirely, anyway. We're up against a pair of siblings, brother and sister, an incubus and a succubus. They seem old for demons. Strong, but not really a threat. Valen propped his right hip against the side of the leather couch, sticking close to Ava. She looked calm on the outside, but something about her warned she was far from it, that she was nervous about being around his brothers again, and had been happier when they had been alone. Gods, he wanted to be alone with her again. At least Karis had only brought Diamond and Ares with him. It made sense. Merrick needed to guard the Seville gates, and Callistos could cover the Paris and London ones in Karis's absence. It was daylight in Hong Kong where Diamond's gate was, and heading towards evening in New York, the city Ares protected. Demons didn't move around during the day, not unless they had a burning desire for a suntan, the sort of tan that turned their skin crispy. The only other brother who could leave their gate unattended right now was Escher, and Valen hadn't expected him to come. Megan had been one mortal too many for Escher. With Ava in the mix too now, he was bound to start keeping his distance as much as he could. Valen couldn't blame him. Ares rested his backside against the sill of the window opposite him and Ava and crossed his legs at his ankles, his heavy-soled black leather boots clunking against the tiles as he set his right foot down. Megan moved to his side, and he slung his arm around her and pulled her into the shelter of his embrace, tucking her against his black t-shirt. She pressed her hand to his black jeans-clad thigh and smiled up at him, her dark chocolate eyes a contrast to Ares, warm where his were cold and wary. Ares glanced down at her, managed to smile, and lifted his hand to tuck a strand of her shoulder-length chestnut hair back into place. She was a contrast to his brother in other ways, too. Her blue jeans, black and white sneakers, and ruby jumpers seemed so bright against Ares' standard black attire. Ares finally dragged his attention away from his female and pinned it on Valen. "Are they working alone?" "No," Ava whispered, and everyone looked at her. She sat her ground, not flinching as all eyes came to rest on her. "Benares didn't seem to want to—" She cut herself off and glanced up at Valen. It was then he knew just how in tune they were with each other. She knew that his brothers knowing about Benares's plans for him wouldn't sit well with him, because it would reveal he had been singled out as the weak one of the herd, one who could be manipulated and turned against his family, and he didn't want his brothers to see him that way too. But they needed to know. He nodded. She lingered, studying him, her blue eyes pulling him deep into them, as if she wanted to be absolutely sure that he was fine with her announcing to his brothers that Benares viewed him as a weak link. He frowned at her. Her lips curved into a little smile. "Message received." He folded his arms across his chest as she turned to his three brothers and Megan and listened as she told them everything. Not quite everything. Thankfully, she omitted some of the more wicked details. Still, he hated standing beside her, listening to her tell his brothers that demons thought they could turn him to their side and use him against them. Diamond's face darkened as he shoved a black leather-gloved hand through his spiked white hair and looked at her. Valen slid his gaze towards him and narrowed it on his brother in a silent warning not to judge Ava. It hadn't been her plan. She hadn't been the one to decide to seduce him. Gods, the drug had taken it out of their hands, unleashing the desire that had already existed in both of them. He shifted as his trousers tightened, easing behind the couch so his brothers didn't get an eyeful of exactly what Ava did to him. Diamond arched an eyebrow at him and then went back to listening to Ava as he idly toyed with the neck of the dark navy roll-neck jumper he wore beneath his black coat. He shuddered and huddled down into it, and Valen felt sorry for the bastard. He couldn't imagine what it was like for Diamond, feeling blasts of frigid cold from time to time as his power acted up. At least Ares' power was fire, so he only had to put up with the occasional hot flush. Ares seemed more interested in coddling Megan than listening to him, that fascination still shining in his gold-flecked brown eyes, warming them as he gently touched her face. Valen also couldn't imagine how that felt. Ares and Diamond had been starved of physical contact from the moment they had been sent to the mortal realm, the manifestation of their powers stealing it away from them. Now Ares could touch a female, and Valen couldn't blame him for taking every opportunity. Fuck. Valen wanted to take every opportunity to touch Ava, and he hadn't even been without physical contact for the last couple of centuries. Karis stared over Ava's head at him, and Valen stared right back, not letting his oldest brother fluster him. He never had been one to back down from a challenge. If Karis wanted a staring contest, then he had one, and he would lose. When Ava fell silent at last, Ares scrubbed a hand over his tawny, overlong hair. Diamond loosed a standard dramatic sigh, and Karis continued to stare. The concern in his brother's emerald gaze put Valen more on edge than facing a legion of demons with a few gods thrown into the mix. "I'll deal with the demon siblings." Valen kept his tone firm enough that it should have eased his brother's concern and the worry steadily building in Ares and Diamond's eyes, too. He pushed his long blonde hair from his eyes as casually as he could manage and shrugged, trying to let their concern roll off him. "Don't worry. They aren't that powerful. The succubus tried to seduce me, and her kiss was hardly anything to write home about." Ava tensed, nothing more than a small tightening of her shoulders, but he noticed it. A feeling arrowed through him, one he found he hated. A cold chasm suddenly opened between them, and it felt as if she was withdrawing from him, distancing herself without moving from her spot on his sofa. He had said something wrong. It didn't take a genius to figure it out, or any of the oh-so-helpful pointed looks from his three brothers. He inwardly grimaced. Maybe casually mentioning how Jin had stuck her tongue down his throat hadn't been his smoothest move. In fact, in the annals of moves, it was somewhere down the bottom, hovering between killing a favorite pet and flirting with a family member. Yeah," Ares said, and disappeared with Megan, leaving a swirl of black smoke behind him. Bastard. He looked to Diamond, but he was already gone. Karis wouldn't ditch him. Big brothers took care of their kid ones in situations like this, didn't they? Valen threw a pleading look in his direction, a first for him, and hoped that the novelty of him asking for assistance for once would gain him some favor and make Karis stay and help smooth things out with Ava. Karis pinched the bridge of his nose, shook his head, and disappeared. Sons of bitches. Still, there was one good thing to come of him putting his foot in his mouth with Ava. If he ever wanted his brothers out of his apartment, he knew just what to do to get rid of them. Ava. He looked down at the back of her head, willing her to look at him. When she remained staring straight ahead, diligently keeping her eyes off him, ignoring him, he sighed and moved around the black leather couch. Valen squatted in front of her, but she still refused to look at him. His earlier words came back to haunt him. He was a massive dick. Under normal circumstances, that was a good thing. Females liked big dicks, right? He wanted to smile at that, but feared Ava would punch it from his face and not understand if she saw it. Females might like large appendages and the pleasure they could give them, but they did not like men acting like those appendages, or acting as if those appendages controlled them. He sighed again. She still refused to acknowledge him. Ava, he whispered and toyed with his words, trying to get them perfect. This was new to him, uncharted territory. He had never cared about a female enough to give a damn about what she thought, or whether he had hurt her or any of that shit. It was a steep learning curve. It didn't help that he'd had the sinking feeling all night since finding her at her apartment that he wasn't the only one who had been kissed by a demon in the last 24 hours. The need to ask her if Benares had kissed her, or if she had kissed that bastard demon back, burned in him, but he tamped it down and stamped it out of existence, because he might be new to handling females in this way, but he wasn't that big of a fucking idiot. She had a right to be pissed at him, and he had a right to be pissed at her too, but one of them had to be the one to take the first step to move past it. "I didn't want her to kiss me," he said to her knees, hating the way she had placed her hands between her thighs because it made her look small, hurt, and he felt responsible. "I made her stop. Actually, I tried to kill her, but then she said if I did, I would never see you again." Her hands tensed, palms pressing harder against each other. "She said Benares." He cut himself off when she tensed further, her entire body going rigid, and cursed himself for bringing up Benares when she was still struggling with what had happened to her. "He kissed me," she whispered, so distant that he wanted to catch hold of her shoulders and shake her out of whatever dark thoughts were pulling her away from him. "He turned into some sort of monster when I hit him, and then he—" She closed her eyes and lowered her head, and gods, he needed to butcher the bastard. When the time came, he was going to take immense pleasure from slowly killing Benares. "He didn't," Valen murmured softly with conviction, not wanting to startle her. All he wanted to do was comfort her and make her believe him. He wanted to make her forget what had happened. He wanted to make her smile again. She opened her eyes and they locked with his, her internal struggle reflected in them. So much hurt, so much fear. She wasn't sure what to feel, what to think, and he hated it and how it clearly tore at her, made her flip between overly bright and darkly melancholic. There had to be a way to ease her mind and settle her heart, and give her some peace so she could find her balance again. Whenever he was troubled, he went to his hill and found comfort in being alone with his thoughts there. He wasn't sure Ava would find being alone comforting, though. Giving her more time to think might only make her worse, giving her fears a stronger hold over her. Being alone wouldn't help her. But would being alone with him? He almost laughed at that. He wasn't sure anyone had ever found his presence comforting. It was worth a shot, though. Not here, though. It had to be somewhere removed from her job if it was going to stop her from thinking about her wretched client and what he had done. Somewhere quiet, where they wouldn't be interrupted, where he could comfort her in the only way he knew worked, by letting down his defenses. She liked it when he was unguarded with her, and that feeling went both ways. He took pleasure from her letting him see glimpses of the heart she kept locked away from everyone, hidden behind a wall of steel as thick as the one that shielded his. He smiled as it came to him. There was only one place where he could take her, one place that felt right, if a little nerve-wracking. A place he had never taken anyone before. People had interrupted him when he was there, his family included, but none of them had been invited. She would be the first. He stood and held his hand out to her, and she looked at it and then up into his eyes. "Go somewhere with me." She looked down at his hand, and for an agonizing moment, he thought she would swat it away and refuse him. A thrill chased through him, leaping up his finger bones and sizzling through his skin when she placed her hand into his. He pulled her up into his arms, savored the feel of her nestled against him, and closed his eyes, focused on their destination, and stepped. Chapter 20. On the list of things Ava hadn't expected when the darkness parted, number one was her stomach not rebelling, and the world around her settling in only a few seconds. Number two was where Valen had taken her. He eased back but kept his arms around her, revealing their location. The hill. She had followed him here once, and at the time she had realized this was more than just a place where he came to enjoy the stunning view of Rome. It was his sanctuary. Back then, she had decided not to follow him here again, and she had told herself she had done so because she wouldn't learn anything new about him by tracking him to the same location more than once. A lie. In reality, she hadn't wanted to intrude. This space had seemed almost sacred, a place where he had been different to the brash, outgoing man she had followed around Rome and studied in its various nightclubs and bars. He had been quiet, introspective, lost deep in thought, and completely unguarded. Vulnerable.
"I've been here before,"
she whispered, afraid of how he might react to that, but needing to put it out there because she didn't want to keep anything hidden from him anymore. Valen released her, rubbed the back of his head, and turned his profile to her, his golden eyes fixing on the distant rooftops of Rome. "I know." Those words were quietly spoken, but they offered a comforting balm to her unsteady heart. "You're not exactly subtle." He slid her a sideways glance that teased her and heated her at the same time. He was trying to cheer her up. She realized that now. He had brought her to this sacred place to share it with her, to give her a reason to feel closer to him and further away from her fears. He wanted her to find the same peace in this place as he did. Ava looked out over the city.
"I'm subtle. I think you cheat."
She could almost feel him frowning as he said, "Cheat?" She nodded, wrapped her arms around herself to keep the chill off, and wished she had brought her jacket. Spring was still struggling to arrive, and the morning air was crisp. It was hardly t-shirt weather.
"I think you have super senses or something,"
she muttered, and Rome turned hazy in her vision as she thought about that and everything else. "And if I do?" he said, and she wasn't surprised to hear it. She shrugged and looked across at him, smiled when she found him looking at her rather than the city.
"It's cheating."
He jammed his hands in his trouser pockets and huffed. "Not as if I can switch it off." His golden eyes roamed back to the city. A breeze chased up the hill, ruffling his blonde hair, making it dance around the other side of his face, and a flicker of surprise did go through her now. He had stood to her right, revealing the scarred side of his face to her, a side he usually tried to keep away from her. Did he know he had done it, or was it a subconscious decision? A sign that whether he knew it or not, he was growing comfortable around her. Silence fell between them, but the chirping of birds heralding the dawn kept it from feeling tense or uncomfortable. It felt natural, a pause in their conversation. Ava glanced at him again. His gaze slid to her, but he didn't move to face her. The corner of his lips quirked. She turned towards him, and he ran his eyes over her. They went round when he reached her feet. Shit. He kicked his boots off, and she frowned. What the hell was he doing? It became clear when he crouched in front of her, lifted her foot, and she almost fell on her backside. She leaned over, pressed her hands against his shoulders to steady herself, and watched as he put his boots on her bare feet. She had forgotten she had no shoes on. Ava stared down at his army boots on her feet. Warm. She lifted her head and smiled down into his golden eyes.
"Thank you. But your feet will get cold."
He rolled his shoulders. "Not really a big deal. I won't get sick, and it takes a lot more for me to feel the cold."
"You never get sick?"
He shook his head, and the longer strands of his golden hair brushed his right cheek. "Call it a perk of being a god." Ava's mouth flapped open. Her eyebrows shot high on her forehead.
"God?"
He looked wonderfully awkward as he rose to his full height and floundered, struggling for words.
"God,"
she murmured, shock sending a ripple of numbness through her as she tried to grasp that. "Not like the god or anything, just a god." He shrugged, but there was nothing casual about it this time.
"But a god. You're a god. Oh my God, your brothers."
"Well, it sort of stands to reason that they would be gods too." He raised his hand to rub his neck, tensed, and lowered it again. "I might get into a little trouble for this."
"For what?"
She was still stuck on trying to wrap her mind around the fact he was apparently a deity. She supposed it explained why he had powers. "Well, you're kind of mortal. It's a no-no."
"Oh."
She stared at him, the shock subsiding as worry replaced it. She didn't want to get him into trouble.
"But I mean, the gods apparently appeared to mortals all the time back in the day. Jupiter was always at it, if you know what I mean."
The touch of color on his cheeks and the way his eyes heated said that he did. That flash of desire was gone a moment later, a frown replacing it. "Jupiter is a pussy." It was her turn to frown. He huffed and looked down at Rome. The whole pantheon sucks. The ground trembled. Valen grinned. When he looked across at her, that grin widened and his eyes sparkled with mischief. They fucking hate it. Ava wasn't following.
Hate what?
Valen sighed, tipped his head back, and stared at the lightning sky. Having a Greek on their turf. A Greek.
So I would do better to mention the fact that
His head snapped down, his eyes bright gold in the low light, and he snarled, Don't mention that fucker. She tensed and shifted back a step. His demeanor instantly shifted, the darkness lifting from it and an apology entering his soft eyes. He did scrub a hand around his neck now. Bastard, he muttered and spat on the grass. Lightning rolled across the cloudless sky. How odd. She blinked, feeling dazed as that one tried to sink in, wanting to laugh at how crazy it was, or how crazy she was. Uncle loves it when I call him that. Valen grinned at her, and then his face fell again. Something wrong? She shook her head, even though everything was wrong. It was all messed up. Valen laughed, a nervous edge to it. I suppose you're right, though. The bastard can hardly punish me for revealing myself as a god when he was always off shagging mortals. He didn't sound sure. The ground trembled again, more violently this time, and she eased closer to Valen, afraid the earth was about to split and swallow her.
The, Roman pantheon gods sound angry, she said, and wished she hadn't, because saying out loud that there were gods ended her ability to pretend that she had imagined everything she had seen, including the freak cloudless lightning. Valen kicked at the grass with his right foot. That wasn't them. It definitely hadn't been an earthquake. So who had made the ground shake? She lifted her head to ask, but Valen's expression warned her not to do it. There was wariness in his eyes that hadn't been there a moment before, a hint of fear that had her holding her tongue. Mentioning that he was a god had set him on edge. Why? It struck her that it was because he thought she would run away, or reject him, or do something to leave him because she was afraid of him now. It wasn't the case at all. If gods were real and he was one, then it explained a lot. Electricity,
she whispered, and caught his frown as she dropped her eyes from his face to his hands. She reached for them, stopped herself before she could touch them, and withdrew. Her gaze leaped to his face. He stared down at his hands, a distant look in his eyes, and a somber air surrounding them. She hadn't meant to hurt him by stopping herself from touching him, but clearly she had. If he thought she was afraid to touch him now, he was wrong about that, too. She edged her right hand towards his left one and brushed her fingertips over the back of it and down his fingers, a thrill tripping through her as they touched. Lightning, he said, and when she looked up at him, added, Technically, I can control electricity, but when I was born, that sort of contained lightning-type energy hadn't been invented. So, lightning.
Lightning,
she whispered, and gasped as tiny white-purple arcs crackled between the fingers of his other hand. She released his left one on instinct. He sighed. I wouldn't hurt you. It was easy for him to say that, but it was human nature to fear electricity. And how difficult would it be for the hand she had been holding to suddenly conduct that electricity too?
When I was seducing you, you needed a time out. I saw your power then.
She looked between his bright golden eyes and his hands. He sighed again and grimaced. Fine. Sometimes it gets the better of me. His tone turned somber again, and he looked off into the distance at Rome. Sometimes I let it. He didn't sound proud of that. He raised his hands in front of him, and little bolts of lightning chased between his fingertips. Ava studied his noble profile in silence, deeply aware of what a big step this was for him. It touched her that he was doing this for her, sharing this place and himself, all in an effort to set her mind at ease. She had the feeling that he would answer any question she asked right now, because he wanted her to feel better, and it was all he felt he could do for her. She would do something for him, too. She would take that same big step and tell him about herself if he asked, would hold nothing back from him, letting him be the first person to know the real her.
What did happen at the club that night, when you reacted to the drink?
He smiled, tipped his head back, and groaned. Not quite what I had expected. That's what happened. I thought maybe it would throw me a little off balance, strip away a few too many inhibitions. I hadn't anticipated it would strip away my control like that instead. He tilted his head towards her. I don't know the why of it. Me and my brothers are just more sensitive to some things. Alcohol, some drugs, caffeine. It makes fuck all sense to me since I can drink in a bar in the underworld and all I do is get drunk. Ava stared at him. He grimaced, turned to face her, and blew out his breath as his hands landed on her shoulders and he crouched so he was eye level with her. Let's just toss some shit out there and then I don't have to worry about it anymore, okay? He said, and she dumbly nodded, still reeling from him talking about the underworld. Hell. He drew in another deep breath and expelled it hard. Here goes nothing. I was born in the underworld. You've probably heard of my parents. I have 6 brothers, all pains in my arse. I was banished here 2 centuries ago by Dad to protect gates between the underworld and this one. Demons like Benares and Jinn are trying to shatter those gates, and if they do, the worlds we love merge and it all goes to shit. Still following? Ava nodded again, her ears ringing and head spinning as she raced to follow him. I'm in charge of Rome, which is why you met my fine arse, and we think Benares and Jinn are part of a group of demons who are behind the calamity the fucking bastard Moirai, Fates, I guess you would know them as, foresaw. She nodded and kept nodding, her gaze glued on his face, but her mind sweeping her away from him, down a vicious rapids that she wasn't sure she would survive. Take any of that in, Valen whispered and looked between her eyes, his narrowing as he searched them. She kept nodding. You're from the underworld. You have brothers. Demons want to destroy everything. You really don't like the Moirai. Because they're bastards, he muttered, and his face darkened, reminding her of the way he had looked when she had almost said Zeus. He hated Zeus, too. Had something happened to make him hate the 3 fates and the king of Greek gods? She wasn't going to ask, because he had that look again, the one that said she would regret it if she dared to voice that question. Still with me? He murmured, voice a low rasp that was far too sexy. She latched onto that and the wicked thoughts it stirred, using it to escape the vortex of craziness of everything he had just said. Ava stopped nodding and stared at him. She had to focus on something small, something she was comfortable with if she was going to take any of this in and believe it was real, not a figment of her warped mind, or his warped mind. She looked down at his hand on her right shoulder. You control lightning. He nodded. She lifted her eyes back to his. Do your brothers too? No. He eased back, released her shoulders, and put his hands behind his neck, clasping it. The action raised the hem of his black t-shirt, flashing a strip of toned stomach at her that had her wicked thoughts escalating, multiplying rapidly. We all have different ones. His expression soured. Except Karis. Being the firstborn, he got the job lot because he's special. Ava had the feeling he hated Karis most of all out of his 6 brothers, and that it was because he believed Karis was special for some reason. Karis wasn't at all special in her eyes. Valen was. She had the feeling she could fall in love with him. She crouched, pressed her hand to the grass, and smiled when she found it wasn't too damp. Good, because she needed to sit down. All of this would be easier to take in if she wasn't standing. She planted her backside on the ground and grimaced as her jeans were instantly wet. Maybe not such a grand idea after all, but she was committed now. Valen sat down beside her, so close she could smell his aftershave and feel the heat radiating off him. He placed his hands behind himself and propped himself up, his long legs stretched out in front of him, his gaze fixed on Rome. She dragged her eyes away from him and looked there too. Dawn was coming, painting the sky with ribbons of gold and pink. It's beautiful. She sighed as she took it in, gave herself a moment to absorb the view and how good sitting here enjoying it with Valen made her feel. She had never watched a sunrise with a guy before. "Was just thinking the same thing," he murmured throatily, and she frowned across at him, wondering what had gotten into him to make him sound so sexy again. He was staring at her. She shoved him in his left arm, making him sway sideways, and his smile was wicked and unapologetic. "Watch the sunrise," she said, putting her best effort into sounding as if she was scolding him, even as she blushed inside at the fact he had called her beautiful. He sighed, but did as she asked. God, this was comfortable, though. Sitting on a damp hillside, watching the sun rising over Rome, next to a Greek god. Not exactly how she had pictured her life going, but she wasn't going to complain about it. She looked down at the city stretching before her, and Benares crept back into her thoughts. But rather than feel shaken by his presence, resolve filled her and she set her jaw as Valen's words swam in her mind. Benares and Jinn wanted to destroy Rome. Like hell she was letting that happen. This was her home, and she was going to fight to protect it, just as Valen did. Chapter 21. "Do you have any guns at your place?" Ava said, and felt Valen's eyes leap from the city to land on her. "Guns?" She nodded, not taking her eyes off the rooftops, seeking out all of her favorite buildings. She could see everything from up here: the Colosseum and the Forum area, the Vatican and the weaving snake of the Tiber as it swept through the city. "I have a few in my bag, but I don't want to go back to my apartment for the others. I left my favorite guns there." She swore his gaze grew more intense, drilling into the right side of her face. He was definitely frowning at her now. "One or two. I mostly have knives." "Why, you thinking of starting a war?" he said, his tone measured and calm. Assessing. He was trying to figure out what she was up to, even when he already knew the truth of it. A truth that he didn't like, so he was looking for another reason, one more palatable to him. Ava glanced across at him. "They already started it for me. I'm just going to finish it." He looked dumbfounded, not quite the reaction she had hoped to get from him. He turned his face away from her, his expression losing all the warmth she had been enjoying, his eyes narrowing and glowing molten gold again. The air around him grew dark, tense in a way she didn't like because she felt as if he was shutting her out, and she frowned at him. "Let it go," he said, his tone as dark as his aura. "It isn't going to happen. I'm not letting you fight." She folded her arms across her chest. "You don't get a say. I'm involved in this, and nothing will change that." "I'm changing it. I'm not going to stand by and let you get yourself killed, Ava." His voice cracked at the end, and he turned his head away from her, and her arms fell back to her sides as she sensed the pain in him, the fear. He didn't want to lose her. "I've spent over a decade as an assassin, Valen. I know how to handle myself. You don't have to worry." She reached out to touch his shoulders, but they tensed, and then he turned on her. "But I do," he barked, and she flinched, her hand hovering in the air between them. "I do. Ava, you spent a decade eliminating mortals. You're dealing with demons now. They're too strong for you to fight." Her lips flattened and she scowled at him. "I bet guns make them bleed just like a mortal." His expression remained dark, his eyes devoid of emotion, cold and hard, the way she hated seeing them. "What use is a gun going to be when they move faster than you can track?" True. An image of Benares suddenly being in front of her flashed across her mind, and she couldn't argue against Valen's point. 1 second Benares had been before her, and when she had turned, he was right there blocking her path. "Knives are better," he muttered, and she had the feeling that he was starting to relent, his defenses weakening as he looked at her. "Maybe a sword." A sword? She couldn't quite believe he had just suggested that. "Who uses a sword?" He glared at her. Clearly, he used a sword. "I thought you liked knives." She must have sounded as unsettled by that thought as she felt, because his frown hardened and he canted his head to one side and studied her. Not good with knives. Ava shuddered and shook her head. Too personal. He clucked his tongue and huffed. Women. Ava punched him in his left deltoid and he glared at her again. Stronzo. He grinned. Love it when you talk dirty. She hit him again. How can you kill with a knife, though? She said, and he turned serious again, a sigh escaping him. I'm used to it, but there was a time when I thought like you do, back when I was young, before my powers had fully manifested and stabilized and I had mastered them. He dropped his gaze to the patch of grass that separated them and picked at the blades with his fingers, and she gave him a moment to collect his thoughts and the courage to keep talking to her, opening himself to her. He twirled a blade of grass he had plucked between his fingers and stared at it. A knife seemed too intimate, and the thought of stabbing or slicing into someone's flesh turned my stomach. Exactly the way she felt. What happened to change that? She didn't want him to stop talking now that he had started, because she finally felt she was coming to know him, that the final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place and completing the picture of him. I went through my trial when I hit 200. Pretty much a teen in mortal terms. Fucking voice hadn't even broken then. I looked like a scrawny little bastard, too. He tossed the blade of grass and sat straight again, crossing his legs. 200. It didn't surprise her to learn that he was far older than he appeared. If he had looked like a teen at 200, he was probably around 3 times that age now, maybe more. He had been in her world for 200 years, too. He slid her another look, one that silently asked her not to probe into his age. She wouldn't. Not yet, anyway. He had been uncomfortable after telling her a little about himself earlier, clearly concerned that the things he was admitting would drive her away. They wouldn't. She was here to stay, and he would tell her in his own time. He yawned, flashing his tongue stud and stirring wicked thoughts that tried to distract her from their conversation. She shoved them out of her head and focused on his eyes instead as they locked with hers. What's a trial? A rite of manhood. He waggled his eyebrows, but the dark edge to his golden eyes said it was nothing to joke about. He wanted to lighten the mood, but she wasn't sure it was possible if he was talking about what she thought he was, being forced into combat in order to prove himself a man. He scratched his left ear and shrugged, as if wanting to shift the heaviness of what he was saying from his back, but it didn't seem to work because he remained stiff, his eyes still dark and haunted. His lips parted on a deep sigh. It's a dad thing. He tried another shrug. This one didn't work either. We get taken off to some remote corner of the underworld and have to get back. It didn't sound so bad if she ignored the fact that the word underworld conjured images of demons more terrifying than Benares, and those creatures that had been sniffing around her apartment building. I had a knife to defend myself. I managed to steal it on the 3rd day, and the owner wasn't happy about it. 3rd day? How far from home had his father taken him? She got the feeling that he hadn't exactly been given a map to find his way home either. She was surprised he didn't have abandonment issues. His father sounded like a real piece of work. Probably not worse than hers had been, though. I quickly learned it was kill or be killed, and I didn't want to die, so I gutted my opponent and moved on. You make it sound easy, she said, and he shook his head, a solemn edge to his eyes. It wasn't. I didn't sleep the night I took my first life. I couldn't close my eyes without reliving it in vivid, gory detail. But I did what I had to do to survive, and I still do now. He looked down the rolling slope to the fields and beyond them to the city. The sun had crept higher, bathing everything in a golden glow, including Valen. If she said he was handsome, he would laugh at her, would try to let it roll off his back, together with the hurt he tried not to feel. She found that sad in a way. It made her want to take hold of him and say it until he believed it was possible for people to like him. And he realized that his brothers were arseholes just like their father, and Zeus and the Moirai for whatever they had done to him to make him hate them too. I killed over 50 warriors of the outer regions before I completed my trials, and lost track of the number of beasts I added to that count, more than any of my brothers had to. He closed his eyes and hung his head, his longer lengths of hair falling forwards. I can still remember every kill. They're branded on my mind, seared there for eternity. Ava's heart went out to him. Her father had been a bastard, violent and cruel, and she was beginning to believe Valen's father had been cut from the same cloth. What sort of man would force their child to fight for his life, to fight to come home? Her eyes slowly widened. He was still fighting to go home.
You said your father banished you here.
He smiled briefly and glanced at her. You noticed that slip, huh? I tried not to think about it that way, but none of us can go back to the underworld until the calamity the bastard Moirai saw is averted and won't come to pass.
And I thought my father was bad.
She turned her cheek to him, drew her knees up, and rested her chin on them, studying Rome as morning light flickered over it and reflected off the windows so it sparkled. How did you end up as an assassin? He asked in a low voice, one filled with caution. You mentioned your family before. Was it because of them? She smiled to let him know she didn't mind him asking. He was answering all her questions, completing her picture of him, so it was only fair she did the same.
My father was one of those men who try to control everything, and who are weak enough to resort to violence if they don't get their way.
He hurt you? Valen growled, and she turned her face towards him, placed her hands over her knees, and leaned her cheek against them. He had that look in his eyes again, the one that told her he wanted to kill for her sake.
He's dead already.
Valen's eyes widened.
No, I didn't do it,
she said quickly before he got the wrong impression.
I hated him for how he treated my mother, how it was fine for him to sleep with other women and betray her. But if a man so much as looked in her direction, she was punished for it, while he lied to her face about his mistresses, saying he only ever looked at her and was only with her.
His face darkened, something surfaced in his eyes, and he looked away. Why? I'm sorry, he whispered, and his shoulders slumped, his hands falling into his lap. I shouldn't have let her kiss me.
God,
she snapped, half shocked, half dismayed.
Don't go comparing yourself to him. If that bitch was anything like Benares, she cast some weird spell on you. It wasn't really your fault.
You don't have to call me God. Valen will do. He smiled, but it was strained, and she hated it. She didn't want him to blame himself for what had happened. She lowered her right hand to his lap and placed it over both of his, stared at them as she wondered whether he would ever stop pulling up his defenses around her, or being so quick to believe he had done something wrong.
Don't blame yourself, Valen,
she whispered and stroked her thumb across his fingers.
I hope you don't blame me.
He turned his hand beneath hers and seized hold of it, squeezed it so hard her bones ached. Never. Bastard demons have some sort of wicked mojo that addles the brain. I'm not even immune to it. But he had told his brothers he didn't need their help and he could handle it. Was he sure that he could resist if Jinn turned on the charm again? She wasn't sure she would be able to break free of Benares' spell if he tried to cast it on her again. She felt weaker now, shaken by events, and she feared it would make it easier for him to pull her under his control. I won't let him hurt you, Valen whispered, dragging her back to him and out of the mire of her thoughts. He raised his other hand and feathered his fingertips over her cheek, his eyes on hers the entire time, overflowing with determination, affection, and dark with a promise she knew he would keep. You were telling me about another bastard in your life. He looked as if he wanted to grimace. She had to admit it wasn't the greatest change in subjects, but it was the one they had been talking about before he had foolishly compared himself to her father. Valen was nothing like him. He couldn't see it, but he was noble and passionate and loyal, and possessive, but not in a bad way. He was possessive in a way that screamed he would do everything in his power, whatever it took, to keep her eyes on him and her heart belonging to him. Hurting her wouldn't even cross his mind, because to his sort of possessive nature it would be a crime, something he couldn't stomach doing. His sort of possessive nature showed itself in a desire to protect and a deep need to cherish. Maybe it was because he had a strong heart filled with love for others, not love for himself.
My father got into bad dealings with some men and got himself killed.
Did she sound as sour about that as she felt?
I wanted him to suffer, eternally if possible, for what he did to my mother, always lashing out at her, always hurting her. I'm sure in the end he was the reason she killed herself.
Ava. Valen laid his palm against her cheek and she closed her eyes, stealing his warmth as it flowed through her and eased her pain.
Her death drove me away from the family. It was my breaking point. I had it out with my father and brother, and I walked out the door and never looked back. I was so mad, I wanted to kill them.
She rested her head more heavily against her knees as memories of those dark days filled her mind.
I had little money, not enough to last more than a few months. I ended up in a bad part of town, working wherever I could, and then I ended up on the streets.
Silence weighed down on her, and she opened her eyes, needing to see Valen to lift it from her and ease her heart. Those days were long gone, nothing more than a distant memory now. She had a home, a safe place to sleep, and enough money to last at least a decade.
It was rough.
She smiled, but she didn't feel it, and the edge to Valen's eyes said that he knew it, that he wanted to pull her into his arms and hold her, but was afraid. This was new for him, too. She toyed with his hand in his lap, unsure of herself, but she had to keep moving forwards, no matter what. They could learn everything about being in a relationship like this together.
I ended up trying to pickpocket the wrong man, and suddenly men in suits were on me. I fought them as best I could and ended up disarming one and knocking another one out before they managed to capture me.
What happened? Valen brushed her hair from her face and swept it behind her ear, his gaze following his fingers, a touch of fascination in it that warmed her and made her want to tease him for being so surprised that she allowed him to do something so intimate with her. His eyes drifted to hers and he shot her a glare.
Message received,
she said, letting him know she wouldn't say a word about it. She poked the end of his index finger with her thumb, letting her focus drop back to them and her past. He had large hands, calloused, but she supposed the hands of a warrior would be worn and rough. She turned her hand in his and frowned at her own calluses. They weren't so different to each other, even if he was a god and she was human.
I thought I was a goner, but it turned out that my fighting spirit had impressed the man I had tried to steal from, who just happened to be the most powerful man in Rome at the time.
Tough gig. He flashed another smile that sent heat pulsing through her. God, he was devastating when he smiled like that.
He offered to train me. I was meant to be security for his daughter, but it turned out I had a natural talent with guns, and my years of sneaking around my family villa trying not to be noticed by my father and brother had made me rather good at following people without being seen and blending into my environment.
So he swapped your job description. She nodded.
I was security for his daughter for a while, but then he didn't want to pay for the running cost for a professional hit on a competitor, so he sent me to do it.
Ava raised her eyes back to his.
Let's just say that you weren't the only one who had trouble sleeping the night after your first kill. I think it took me a week to get some sleep, and then it was only because I collapsed from exhaustion.
But you kept doing jobs? His golden eyebrows dipped low and his irises blazed like fire. She shrugged.
You don't really get a choice. Once I started down that path, I had to keep walking it. The alternative was leaving, and you don't just leave that world and Rome's most powerful boss.
Valen's handsome face blackened. He would have killed you.
He's dead, too,
she said before he could offer to kill him. He arched an eyebrow at her. She shot him a look that challenged him to say he wasn't going to say it. He huffed and looked away from her, a definite pout to his lower lip.
It didn't take me long to get used to it.
She prodded his fingers, but he refused to look at her.
I guess I'm like you after all.
He sighed. We're a pair, all right. He slanted his gaze down at her and smiled. Ava smiled back at him, silently thanking him for trying to lighten the mood. You'll be fine. His smile dropped, his expression turning so serious all of a sudden that hers fell with it, and his voice lowered into a dark growl. I won't let that demon and his bitch hurt you. Next time I see the bastard, he's going to pay. She didn't fail to notice the way his hand rose to his face, and his fingers came to rest on his scar as he said that, and couldn't stop the feeling that went through her. There was a meaning behind his actions, a story behind that scar, and she needed to know it if she was ever going to understand him. Chapter 22. Valen tensed as Ava's slender hand came to rest over his, and her fingers brushed his scar. He wasn't sure how she could bear to touch it. Why didn't she think it was ugly or frightening, like every other person he had met?
How did this happen?
She murmured, voice low and cautious, as if she had sensed the tension mounting inside him, the need to push her away and tell her not to look at him, not to look at the mark of his sin. A mark he had to live with forever. He pulled his hand from under hers, dropped them both into his lap, and curled them into fists as he looked away from her, turning his head to his left to hide his scar. Her touch softened, the light sweeps of her fingers over the puckered, ruined skin tearing at him, pulling down his defenses and weakening him, making him vulnerable. The tension building inside him twisted tighter, pushed harder, and he closed his eyes to shut her and the world out.
Not going to tell me?
She whispered, her warm voice coaxing him into doing just that, bewitching him and making him want to tell her. He couldn't. She had looked horrified enough when he had told her about his right and the things he had done then. If he told her about how he had killed the Moirai in cold blood and tried to give his uncle the same fitting end, it didn't bear thinking about how she would look at him then, if she would look at him at all. He wouldn't blame her if she walked out of his life. He didn't want that to happen, though, so he kept his mouth shut and pushed away the side of him that wanted to tell her, because it foolishly hoped things would turn out differently from how he knew they would, and she would stay.
Tell me how you got it.
Her voice was stronger, almost demanding. She pressed her hand against the scar and tried to make him look at her. He growled and knocked her arm away. Her beautiful blue eyes held a flicker of hurt as she flexed her fingers, conflict dancing across her delicate features, as if she wanted to try to touch him again. She lowered her hand to her knee instead and muttered,
Sorry I asked.
Was he being a dick again? It certainly felt like he was, and that strange gnawing feeling was back, eating away at him and making him want to tell her that he was the one who should be apologizing to her. It also made him want to tell her why he didn't want to share that part of his sordid history with her. But memories of that day were beginning to crowd in the corners of his mind, and he didn't want to go there. Not today. He wasn't strong enough today. He felt too uncertain of everything, and his demons were back, whispering in his ear that no one could love him, especially if they knew he had gone on a bloody rampage to slay 4 gods in the name of revenge. Valen glanced across at her, gaze tracing her profile and heart memorizing how she looked in the morning light, the golden glow of sunrise bathing her clear skin with warmth and the light breeze teasing the straight strands of her jaw-length hair, making the blue streaks dance amidst the black. He could sit for hours just watching her like this, but he needed to say something to clear the air between them and make her look at him again. He needed to snap her out of her thoughts before she got mad at him. He didn't want her scowls and her sharp words. He wanted her smiles and her laughter. Want to see a magic trick? He said, and her blue eyes slid his way.
You can do magic, too?
He hadn't meant it quite like that, but the bright shine in her eyes told him she was interested. Not magic like you're thinking. He smiled slowly. although I can pull a rabbit out of thin air. He thought he could anyway. Not a real rabbit. He studied the sky and then Rome, charting all the positions of the lightning rods he had installed, trying to figure out if it was possible. It would take a little effort on his part, but it would be worth it. He just hoped he didn't fail dismally. Valen stood, brushed his damp backside down, and focused. It started as a small dark patch in the sky over Rome that quickly grew, and then clouds spilled from it, rolling across the blue canvas. He hated rain, but he wasn't meant to make lightning without clouds. An order from those bastards on high. Funny how Zeus was allowed to do it, though. Ava's eyes landed on him, sending a hot shiver dancing down his spine and along his limbs. He looked down at her, grinned as he caught her staring at his backside, and she tensed and blushed, her gaze zipping away from him. Gods, he loved how she reacted to him like that. Not the cold, merciless assassin, but a shy yet alluring female.
"You're wet," she muttered.
Yeah, good excuse. Now pay attention, because I'm about to create something far more spectacular for you to look at than my arse. He hoped. He sucked in a few breaths, flexed his fingers, and stared at the clouds, psyching himself up. He could do this. He had made dragons. He could master a bunny. He just had to do a rabbit perched on its back legs with its ears on alert. Simple. Right? He flexed his fingers again and cursed the way they shook and the uncertainty racing through him. It had been a long time since he had felt this nervous about using his power. He glanced at Ava again. She sat with her long, lean legs stretched in front of her and crossed at the ankles, her hands planted behind her to support her as she waited, and an expectant look on her face that told him to amaze her. Performance pressure sucked. You sure you want a rabbit? He gave her a hopeful look. She frowned up at him.
You suggested a rabbit, not me.
Can't interest you in something else? He smiled and cursed again as it trembled, probably flashing his uncertainty at her like a neon sign.
I thought you were some big, powerful god.
She smiled wickedly.
If you are, then I'm sure you can handle a little rabbit.
He narrowed his eyes on her, silently cursing her this time. No damn way she was going to get away with questioning his prowess as a god. You want a bunny? He snarled. You'll get a fucking bunny. He whipped his head around, forced all of his focus to his hands as his power accumulated there, and pointed out all the places in the city he wanted the lightning to strike. He raised his right hand in front of him, pressed his thumb and index finger together. Clicked. White-purple lightning shot from the boiling black clouds, a little faster than he had anticipated. Blame his mood for that. He quickly snapped his fingers again, adding a second to join the first bolt, and focused to command them. They split and then split again, laced together and shot through each other, forming branches across the sky, taking on a shape above the city. Valen groaned inwardly at the sight of it. The lightning connected with the rods on the buildings and the air rumbled with the force of each strike, the ground trembling with it as thunder rolled across Rome. The image he had created stuttered and died, and he wanted to do the same. Silence fell. Thick, oppressive, nerve-destroying silence. And then Ava spoke.
I didn't expect that.
He huffed. I was unfocused, distracted by someone teasing me. My mind got a bit off track.
Well, it was sort of on track.
She sounded as if she was going to laugh, so he scowled down at her. Her lips trembled as she fought to contain the smile that was already in her eyes.
I mean, you did say fucking bunny.
He grimaced, aware he was never going to live this one down, and hoping she was the only one that had seen a startlingly explicit image of two bunnies going at it appear above the sky of Rome this morning. He didn't want to even consider the rumors that would spread about him, or the nicknames he would pick up, if any gods had witnessed it.
Can you make other shapes?
She beamed up at him. He glared at her. Don't say it like that, as if screwing bunnies is in my repertoire of images I enjoy forming with my powers. That laugh that had been building inside her escaped. His frown melted under the intense heat that spread through him, rolling outwards from his chest, On hearing it and seeing her face lighting up, all the shadows lifted from it. He supposed he had succeeded in his desire to cheer her up, even if the method hadn't been quite what he had intended. I can make a few. He thought about what she might like to see next. If it kept her smiling and laughing, he would take a shot at creating whatever she suggested, and he wouldn't stop until she was done or he was utterly drained of strength. Any requests?
An eagle.
She looked up at him.
Can you do that?
An eagle was close to a dragon, and he could do that, so it shouldn't be too much of a challenge. Sure. He shot her a smile and absorbed the way she turned all female and cute again. His little killer. He found this side of her almost as alluring as her warrior one, possibly more so because she showed it only to him. Valen focused and snapped his fingers, calling the lightning from the clouds and conducting it so it created the image of an eagle with its wings spread above Rome. Fitting, he supposed. It had been the seat of the Roman Empire, and they had loved their eagles. Ava laughed again, the light sound filling his mind and his heart, warming him as the rain began to fall and keeping the chill off his skin. She ordered another animal and then another, not seeming to care about the rain as it fell on her. He hadn't done this in a long time. The warmth in him died as that thought invaded his mind, dragging up memories that still hurt. Calindria had always loved it when he had made shapes for her in the underworld. Dragons had been her favorite. Back then, he had loved creating shapes with his power, amusing her and giving those gifts to her, whatever she requested. Since her death, he had only made images when his mood had taken a nosedive, using them to shake the earth and rattle the heavens, and unleash all of his pain. It was strange to take pleasure in doing this again, the good sort of pleasure, the sort he had found in it before Calindria's death. Afterwards, he had taken a darker sort of pleasure from it, giving his power control over him and feeding off it and how strong it made him feel. Invincible, dangerous, and terrifying. A god.
Valen,
Ava whispered, and he realized he had stopped and was standing like an idiot in the rain, his hand outstretched in front of him, frozen in time. Transported back through it to relive those better days that still scraped at his chest, hollowing it out whenever he thought about them. He snapped himself out of the past and focused on the present, because there was no point in looking back. What was done, and he couldn't change it now. He hadn't been able to change it back then either. He hadn't been strong enough. He looked across at Ava, found her standing beside him with warmth in her blue eyes, concern that was for him, and he cherished it, held it to his chest and refused to relinquish it even as that dark voice in his mind chanted that she would never be his. No one could love him. Zeus had made sure of that.
Valen.
She lifted her hand to his face and placed it gently against his scar, as if she had sensed it was the source of his pain, the mark of the sin he had to bear for eternity. He fell into her eyes, into the affection they showed him, fear snaking through his veins to stir other emotions, to create a strange sense of urgency and panic that he couldn't control, a crushing need that consumed him, a sense that if he could just keep hold of Ava, that he could break this curse and she would fall in love with him, like he was falling in love with her. He grabbed her shoulder, yanked her into his arms, and kissed her, desperate need driving him, pushing him to do whatever it took to make her feel something for him, to make sure she didn't leave him. She responded instantly, but her kiss was brief, and he wanted to snarl when she pushed her palms against his chest and broke away from him. No. Cold swept through him, the fear that gripped him rising to sink its claws into his heart, as it whispered that it was already too late. He was already losing her. He dug his fingers into her shoulders and tried to pull her back to him, convinced that if he just kept kissing her, if he kept making her laugh and smile, and kept her to himself for long enough, that she would love him. She wouldn't leave him. She wouldn't turn against him like everyone else. He couldn't bear it if she did. It would end him. She resisted him, and fear birthed anger in his veins, the darker side of his blood awakening and demanding that he bend her to his will. She would be his.
Valen,
she whispered, stopping him dead as he tried to pull her back to him and kiss her again. He lifted his eyes to hers, and the haze filling his mind, seizing control of him, dissipated, as he stared into her striking blue ones and saw not hate, but deep affection in them. There was hurt there, too, and fear. He eased his grip on her shoulders and cursed himself for holding her too tightly, for trying to force himself on her. He was no better than Benares. He went to withdraw, but she caught his arms, her hands warm against his biceps, and shook her head, causing the damp strands of her jaw-length dark hair to stick to her cheeks. "I'm not done with you," she said, a sharp, commanding edge to her voice that was too damn sexy. The determination that had flashed across her features faded and her grip loosened, her voice losing its hardness, softening with shyness that was equally as seductive. "I can feel your power flowing under your skin. What if your tongue stud is metal?" Sweet gods, everything about this woman tied him in knots and pulled him deeper under her spell. That's what had made her pull away from him and had put fear in her eyes? Not his behavior or her feelings for him, but his power? She was afraid his tongue stud might spark and hurt her. He grinned, the weight lifting from his heart, and the darkness in his veins fading as he brushed her hair behind her ear and thought about that. "It won't hurt you. It's titanium." His grin widened as she looked up at him, right into his eyes, hers dark and hungry, and filling him with a need to make them even darker, even hungrier. "It doesn't conduct well, but it might tingle if you're lucky." Her eyes went a little wider, a little darker. Valen growled and pulled her back into his arms, slanted his head and kissed her hard, letting her know in the only way he could right now that she was his, and he was never letting her go. He would break this curse. He would make her love him. Chapter 23. Ava rubbed a towel over her wet hair, every inch of her relaxed and sated. Valen had made sure of that. He had tried so hard to cheer her up and set her mind at ease, both about Benares and about him and this crazy new world she had fallen into. And then he had shown her just how incredibly beautiful his power could be. He had done it all for her. She paused with the towel against her head and stared into the mirror. Something had happened, though. Something that had stopped him in the middle of making a shape for her out of lightning and had hurt him. Something she wanted to know, but she hadn't had the chance to ask him about. And now she felt awkward about mentioning it, because he seemed so much brighter. The darkness and pain that had been in his eyes lifted because of her. She had kissed it out of him, or he had kissed it out of himself. She touched her lips, swore they still tingled from the force of that kiss, one that had held a note of desperation, and filled her with a sense that his thoughts were leading him down dark paths again. He had been quiet when they had returned to the apartment, and had made her sleep to recoup her strength, promising to watch over her. She hadn't thought it would be possible for her to sleep, not with all the thoughts about him and Benares, and that demon's plans for him ricocheting around her mind. But she had closed her eyes anyway. When she had opened them again, the sky beyond the windows of Valen's bedroom had been laced with the colors of evening, and he had been sitting beside her on the bed, watching over her just as he had promised. She had kissed him for that, a kiss that had led them into the shower together. Now he had disappeared into the other room without a word to her, leaving her alone to dry off. What was weighing on his mind? If she asked, would he share it with her? She wanted to draw him back to her, because it felt as if he was drifting away, and she didn't like the chasm that was opening between them. She finished drying her hair, tossed the white towel on the floor with his one, and combed her fingers through her hair, styling it as best she could without her usual products. Ava glanced along the wood-paneled corridor towards the living room, thought about sauntering in there naked to seduce him all over again, and then thought better of it. She wanted him to talk to her, to open up to her as he had on the hill, and getting him all hot and bothered wasn't going to achieve that. She went into the bedroom instead, grabbed her duffel bag from near the door and put it down on the bed. She rifled through it, reassured by the sight of her guns and the spare clips and boxes of ammunition, and chose a simple dark green halter top and a fresh pair of black jeans. She fished out the spare black lace bra and a pair of matching shorts and slipped into them, and then into her top and jeans. Socks followed, and then she sighed as she pulled out her only footwear, black running shoes. Not her taste, but they were compact and fitted into the bag, a bag that was meant to be used in an escape. Running shoes made sense in that scenario, more than her favorite boots anyway. She tugged them on and laced them, zipped the bag closed, and placed it back near the door. Music drifted into the room. She paused, leaning over the bag, and frowned into the corridor. Classical music, too. It was soothing, calming, and so unexpected. She would never have guessed Valen liked such music. She drifted out into the corridor and along it to her left, following the mellow sound into the living room. Sure enough, Valen was reclining in his wing-back armchair beside the unlit fire, his black t-shirt and combat trousers making him blend into it. His eyes were closed, his chin dipping low towards his chest as he sat there, listening to classical music. She had figured he would like something harder, a fast-pounding beat of the rock persuasion. It seemed so odd seeing him like this. Was he asleep? She startled when he spoke. Sometimes it's only the music that holds me together and stops me from crossing the line. It was. She listened to it as she studied him, finding the soft string melody as soothing as he clearly did. What would happen if he did cross that mental line he had drawn for himself? He had admitted that he wasn't proud of how he let his power control him at times. She recalled the bar and the devastation he had wrought without using his lightning, and found she didn't want to imagine how bad things might have been if he had unleashed it. Mother gave it to me. Escher, too. She says that it soothes Dad's rages and that she sees a lot of him in me. He pulled a face that said he didn't like that. You hate him. Although she wasn't really sure that was the case, because he always used a shorter name than Father for him, one that spoke of affection rather than coldness and distance. He finally opened his eyes and looked at her. They were molten gold again, glowing fiercely in the fading light of evening. The pain that had been in them since he had fallen quiet on the hill was still there, lurking in his eyes. Not hate, he muttered, and pushed his fingers through his hair, sweeping it back so it streaked straight over the top from his brow to the back of his head. Mutual dislike, maybe. Mutual? She frowned at that. He doesn't like you? It would explain the awful rite he had put Valen through. Not anymore. He looked away from her, gazed out of the window to his right, and his whole demeanor turned uncomfortable, silently telling her to drop the subject. For once, that wasn't going to happen. She wanted to know about him, and if that meant poking at sore spots, then she would risk his wrath by doing just that. Besides, there was a question she had wanted an answer to since he had told her his short and shocking breakdown of important points about himself. You said he banished you from the underworld, and now you protect gates to it. Just who is your father? She had a theory, but she wanted to hear him say it. His eyes slid back to her, a dark edge to them that was more than just a feeling. Black ringed his irises, eating away the gold. He had looked that way before, when she had fought him. At the time, she had thought she had imagined it, but as she watched the black swallowing the gold, she could no longer deny it had been real. Say it, she whispered, suddenly unsure whether she wanted to know. His black eyes narrowed on her. Elongated canines flashed between his lips as he spoke. Hades, the god of the underworld. His father was the boss down there, the Greek equivalent of the devil, she supposed, although she wasn't sure how close that was to the truth. Her mind latched onto it, though, ran with it and pulled her along for the ride, making her envisage a dark and terrifying man, a cruel and vicious ruler fitting for that domain. Valen clucked his tongue at her. Already made up your mind, I see. She froze, shock rippling through her as she realized she had backed away from him. She hadn't meant it like that. It wasn't Valen she feared. It was his father. Benares was only a demon, and he terrified her. She couldn't imagine how frightening Hades was. She didn't want to. Valen muttered something and looked away from her again, and the darkness in his eyes faded, allowing gold to break through.
"You're not like him,"
she blurted, and he arched an eyebrow but didn't shut her down. She crossed the room to him, navigating her way around the black leather couch, and stopped beside him. He refused to look up at her.
"I've seen you do good as well as bad."
His handsome face blackened, the darkness obliterating the gold in his eyes, and he turned sharply to face her. "I'm not a hero, Ava. Stop expecting that of me," he snapped, and she eased back a step, reeling from that blow. Where'd that come from? She hadn't meant it like that. He was overreacting. The pain was back in his eyes, fiercer than before, and he abruptly turned his face away from her again. The soles of her feet warmed in her shoes. A feeling bloomed in her chest, a strange sensation that seemed to link her to him and revealed something to her. Her words had touched a raw nerve. She wasn't sure how she knew it or where the feeling had come from, but she suddenly understood him. On the hill, pain from the past that was still raw for him had returned, awakened by what he had done for her, and that pain was still eating at him. Pain that was born of great loss and the devastating consequences of it. Her head lightened. She swayed on the spot as it seemed to pull her downwards. Her knees gave out. "Ava!" he roared, and she moaned as he caught her, his strong arms supporting her, stopping her from hitting the tiled floor. She blinked to clear her blurry vision and breathed hard, all of her strength leaving her as her feet cooled and the weird lightness drifted away. Valen loomed over her, no trace of black in his golden eyes as they searched hers. There was only fear and concern, worry that flooded her with warmth. "What happened?" he murmured and slowly righted her. She didn't fight him as he checked her over, one hand remaining against her waist to keep her upright.
"I don't know. I can't explain it."
She squeezed her eyes shut and prickles blazed down her spine and over her arms. What was wrong with her? "Try," he snapped, a little harsh, and then softly muttered in a more apologetic tone. "Please." She had frightened him. It had frightened her, too.
"I felt... This is going to sound crazy, but I felt connected."
She pushed the words out when he looked up at her, the warmth and worry leaving his face, morphing back into something dark.
"To you."
Valen growled, shot to his feet, and stamped them against the terracotta tiles. "No meddling." Her eyes widened. Had he gone mad? She looked down, and her eyes went even wider as she spotted the blue cornflower he was crushing beneath his boots. Where had that come from? She was sure it hadn't been there when she had crossed the room to him. She would have noticed it. Ava squatted and caught his boot, stopping him, and he froze, his gaze landing on her and heeding her. She plucked the broken flower from the tiles and gasped as the damage to it reversed before her eyes. Valen snatched it from her, stormed across the room to the set of windows to the left of the fireplace, opened it, and threw the flower out. He slammed the window closed again, turned to face her, and halted. "Don't look at me like that. She was meddling."
"Like what? Bewildered? Because that's all I'm feeling."
She looked down at where the flower had been and touched the floor. It was cold now. She was sure it had been warm.
"What the fuck just happened?"
"Meddling," he muttered as if that was an explanation. He strode over to her, long legs making short work of the distance, and stopped right in front of her. He looked pissed. She wasn't sure why, and she didn't feel she had done anything wrong, so he couldn't be mad with her. He was mad with whoever had apparently meddled. He huffed and held his hand out to her. "Resist her next time." Ava wasn't sure she wanted to resist whoever had linked her to Valen, because she had been trying to give her answers to the questions burning inside her. She had been trying to reveal the parts of Valen he wanted to keep hidden from her for some reason, parts she knew she needed to understand.
"I don't even know who I'm meant to be resisting."
She placed her hand into his and let him help her onto her feet. He sighed again and turned his cheek to her. "Mother." So his mother, Persephone, if she had her goddesses right, had tried to reach out to her to give her insight into Valen. His mother wanted her to know the things he wouldn't tell her. Did that mean she approved of her? Ava wasn't sure how to take that. A goddess approved of her. A goddess wanted her to make this thing with her son work. She smiled as it dawned on her. Persephone wanted Valen to be happy, and she thought Ava could do that for him. She had half a mind to say thank you to Persephone out loud so she would know to ignore Valen's efforts to stop her, and would keep trying to help her unravel her son's defenses and see the part of him he was still guarding fiercely, unwilling to show it to her.
I think I like her,
Ava said, and he growled at her this time. She refused to do as he demanded, wouldn't say that she would try to resist Persephone if she reached out to her again. If his mother wanted to meddle in their relationship, Ava wasn't going to stop her. It went against her Italian blood, because mothers were meant to be her nemesis, the ones who stood between her and claiming all of their son's love. But she was dealing with Greeks now, not fellow Italians. Different rules applied. It seemed Greek mothers wanted to help the women who tried to claim their sons' hearts. Or at least Greek goddesses did. It still felt crazy thinking that, but she was slowly coming to terms with this world she had stepped into the night she had taken Benares's job. She shifted her gaze to Valen. He scowled at her. "Don't look at me like that." Her eyebrows rose. It was the second time he had said that, but she still wasn't sure what was wrong with the way she was looking at him.
Like what?
I told you. I can't be what you expect of me. He plowed the fingers of his left hand through his hair and pulled it back, tugging at his scalp, and frustration mounted in his eyes, making them flash gold at her. What had started this war in him? He ground his teeth, looked as if he would turn away from her and shut her out again, and then barked, "You look at me like I'm going to save you somehow, like I'm your only fucking hope, and I don't want that responsibility. I just can't do it. I failed the last time someone trusted me to protect her." Ava's heart ached, the sight of him as his strength visibly left him and the pain came rushing back into his eyes, pulling her to him, filling her with a need to comfort him. He was wrong. He was hurting and he was trying to pin it all on her in order to cope with it, because he honestly believed he would fail in protecting her too. He was afraid. He sank into the wingback black leather armchair and hung his head forwards, his elbows resting on his knees and his blonde hair falling to obscure his face. He was afraid that he wouldn't be able to protect her as he had promised, that Benares would hurt her because of it, possibly even kill her. Where had the brash, confident, and almost cocky male who had vowed to keep her safe gone? The man who had offered to destroy Benares for her? She slowly padded across the tiled floor towards him, her heart answering that question. There was something inside him, a dark and terrible monster born of his past, and it had awakened on the hill, had risen up to devour his strength and feed on his fears. She wasn't sure she could vanquish such a monster, because she couldn't defeat the ones that lurked inside her, created by her past too. But she was going to try because she hated seeing him like this. She wouldn't let him push her away.
I never asked you to be a hero, Valen.
She kneeled between his feet, lifted her hands, and cupped both of his cheeks. He tried to look away from her, but she held him firm, keeping his golden eyes on hers.
I don't expect that of you.
He stared into her eyes for long seconds, and then leaned back, sinking into the chair and leaving her sitting between his knees. His eyes remained on hers, and she cursed how good he looked as he sat there staring down the length of his body at her, the honed muscles of his torso visible beneath his tight black t-shirt, and the heat building in his eyes calling to her. She managed to keep her eyes fixed on his, not allowing him to distract her with his delicious body or that wicked promise in his eyes, because she felt close to getting answers.
I don't need you to protect me.
She didn't really believe that, but if it eased his mind and weakened the hold his fears had on him, she would say it 1,000 times until he believed it. Good, he said, a sharp edge to his tone that cut through the air like a blade. He didn't mean that. She could see it in his eyes.
Who was she?
She searched those eyes, wanting to find the answer in them, because she knew he wouldn't tell her. Had it been a lover? It had clearly been someone dear to him, and failing her had wounded him deeply, carving a scar in his heart that had never healed. It had left him with the feeling he wasn't qualified to protect anyone, that he would fail if he tried again. Yet he still wanted to protect her. He wanted to try. For her. Calindria. That delicate name echoed in her mind in Karis's voice. In this very room when Karis had confronted Valen after the incident at the bar, and Valen hadn't defended himself, that was the name Karis had thrown at Valen. That was the straw that had broken him, and he had left without a word. Ares and Marek had been shocked to hear Karis throw it at Valen with so much venom.
Who was Calindria?
She whispered. Valen tensed, looked away from her. She shook inside as she waited, needing to know whether she had been his lover, afraid to know the answer now, because suddenly it felt as if she would never compare to the woman Valen had lost and still grieved, still loved. He closed his eyes, his chest heaved as he sighed, and his lips moved almost soundlessly. Almost. She barely caught the two words. Our sister. When he opened his eyes, they were locked on her, intense and focused, sending a shiver down her spine and spreading heat along her limbs. Let it go now. She nodded, because she didn't want to drag up any more bad memories for him and cause him more hurt. He had failed to protect his sister, and he blamed himself for it. Did his brothers blame him too? His father? It would explain the animosity he felt towards them, their strained relationship. But then there was also another way to explain all of that. Valen blamed himself for their sister's death, and it had led him to believe that everyone else blamed him too. Ava rose onto her knees between his, wrapped her arms around his waist, and ignored the shock that rippled across his face as he looked down at her. She pushed up on her toes and kissed him, so he would know that he wasn't alone, that not everyone in this world was against him. Someone believed in him. He wouldn't fail her. She knew that in her heart. He tensed, lips freezing against hers, and then kissed her on a low growl. His arms snaked around her, and he hauled her up onto his lap, making her sit on his left thigh. She lost herself in the kiss again, wanted to wiggle on his thigh as heat built inside her with each wicked stroke of his tongue that made her feel the stud in it. He stopped again. Another growl. Ava tried to pull back to ask him what was wrong, but he dragged her against him and kissed her harder, and she forgot all about it, until his lips paused a third time.
What's wrong?
She murmured against them. Fucking gate, he snarled. Hardly an explanation. Ignore it. He claimed her lips again, and she tried to do as he had said, but it was impossible when he kept tensing beneath her as if someone was prodding him in the ribs.
Seriously.
She pulled back, and he let her this time. He scowled at her, but she had the feeling his anger was aimed at the gate and not her for stopping kissing him.
Explain.
She wanted to pepper his cheeks with kisses, but he looked as if that might be nothing more than torture, and she had the sinking feeling he was about to say something she wasn't going to like. I have to go out, he muttered, voice a dark growl of disappointment and fury. Stupid gate is calling me. I have to go open it. He kissed her again, so hard and demanding that she sank into him and came close to begging him to ignore it, just as he had said. The gates were important, though. She had gathered that much from what he had told her.
If you don't go, and demons opened it, would that be enough for something terrible to happen to this world and the underworld?
She brushed her lips across his with each word, and he groaned, tried to kiss her again, but she stopped him. His scowl was definitely for her this time. He snorted. No.
Explain.
She was getting tired of this.
Just tell me what happens if you don't go.
A very annoyed hellspawn who wants to travel either to the underworld or from it tells my father what a failure I am. Nothing he doesn't already know. He smiled at her blank expression. Hellspawn are what I like to think of as acceptable demons. Dad hates all demons, but over the centuries he's given the green light to some of the purer breeds that weren't involved in the uprising, and allows them to come and go between the underworld and this one. Of course, other species of Hellspawn have slipped the other way, falling out of favor and finding themselves banished.
So Hellspawn are like good demons.
The more he told her, the more questions she had. He grimaced. If you want to think of them like that, sure. They didn't try to destroy the palace and everyone in it to seize the underworld, so they get a pass. But the other demons didn't. They weren't allowed in the underworld now. By the sound of things, it hadn't stopped them from wanting to go there. One day she was going to make Valen sit down and tell her everything from start to finish, and she wasn't going to let him move until he had answered all of her questions. Today was not that day, though.
So this gate thing is calling to you because someone wants it open,
she said, and he nodded.
No one else can open it?
He answered that one with a shake of his head. It seemed to her that things were always more complicated than Valen made them out to be. He did more than just protect the gate in Rome from demons. He was responsible for allowing people to pass through it, too. A gatekeeper. Without him there, whoever was waiting to use it wouldn't get through.
So you have to go?
She hated the way her voice wavered as she asked that, betraying her nerves as they began to creep back in. Having Valen around her every waking and sleeping minute had comforted her so much that now she was afraid to be without him. Damn him. Damn her for being so weak, too. But she was dealing with forces far more powerful than she was, and she was beginning to believe that Valen was right, and guns wouldn't prove useful against a monster like Benares. She glanced at the window into the darkness. What if Jinn was still watching them? What if she reported to Benares that Valen had left her alone? What if Benares came for her? Valen's palm came to rest against her left cheek, and he slowly eased her head around towards him. His eyes locked with hers, a silent promise in them, one that contradicted his earlier outburst and the demands he had issued, telling her not to rely on him to protect her. You'll be safe here. He swept the pad of his thumb across her cheek, his eyes falling there to track it, a hint of fascination filling them and smoothing their hard edges. I have wards around this building and this apartment. If anyone tries to break through them, I'll know. I'll come back. I'll keep you safe. She nodded, trying to take comfort from that, but her mind had latched on to the part where he had made it sound possible for someone to get through these wards. She didn't let him see the fear that still lingered inside her. He would refuse to leave if he did, and it was time she stood on her own 2 feet again and moved on with her life. It was time she stopped being so weak, so afraid. She was strong. He slid his hand around the back of her head, pulled her down to him, and kissed her hard, his roughness screaming of desperation that rang through her, too. A fierce need to take all she could from this moment and never let it go. He broke away, growled something, and then forced a smile. Be right back. He disappeared. She dropped to the seat of the armchair and wafted her hand in front of her face, dissipating the black swirling ribbons he had left behind him. He would be right back. She had no reason to fear. She would be safe here. Benares needed her alive. She kept telling herself that, slowly coming to believe it, as she moved around the apartment, stealing a can of lemonade from the refrigerator in the kitchen beyond the living room, and peeking behind all the pale wooden doors of the cupboards. Valen apparently liked pasta with a vengeance. She was fairly sure she had spotted it in every cupboard. He had a variety of sauces, too, together with a shelf stocked with every imaginable herb and spice, and stacks of passata bottles. Did he like to cook? She poked her nose back into his tall silver refrigerator. There were some vegetables in the bottom drawer. Her stomach growled. Maybe she could knock herself up some food while she waited for him. She looked at the door of the apartment. He would be back soon. She could make them some dinner to surprise him when he returned. Ava busied herself with finding all the pots and pans she needed, and rifling through the cupboards and refrigerator for ingredients. She filled a large pan with water and put it on the hob, and set about dicing onions and vegetables for the sauce as the water came to a boil. She lost track of time as she focused on her work. The sound of her phone ringing rose above the quiet classical music that still filled the apartment. She set down her knife, wiped her hands on a towel, and left the kitchen. She hummed to herself in time with her ringtone as she crossed the living room to the bedroom where she had left it on the side table. A quick glance at the display had her frowning. A former client. At least it wasn't Benares phoning her for a report. She turned away, not interested in anything he might have to say. She wasn't looking for work. Not now and not for a while to come. She needed a break. A long one. Maybe somewhere warm and sunny. Like Greece. She kept humming the tune as she headed back towards the kitchen, her thoughts returning to making dinner. She couldn't wait to sit down at the heavy wooden table in the dining side of the kitchen with Valen. Although she wasn't sure whether it was because she wanted to eat dinner with him, amaze him with her cooking, or just wanted to eat. Her stomach growled again. Maybe it was the latter. His company was just a bonus. She smiled at that, and how he would scowl at her if she said such a thing to him. Ava gasped as she walked into something. Something not furniture. Not Valen. She stumbled back a few steps, pulling herself together, sure that it was just one of his brothers and there was no reason to panic. She would tell them he was out, and they would leave, and she could keep cooking dinner. Her words died on her lips as she looked at the man, and didn't recognize him. He ventured a step towards her, his short white robe shifting against his bare thighs beneath his golden armor that made her think of one of those tacky gladiators outside the Colosseum. Only this man wasn't looking to make a quick euro off an unsuspecting tourist. She was fairly certain he wasn't human, not a man in the conventional sense of the word. He was a god. She backed off, keeping the distance between them steady. Valen is out. He smiled, causing wrinkles beside his golden eyes, but there was no feeling in it. I know. He moved faster than she could track, suddenly before her with his right palm pressed between her breasts. Her heart thundered and she tried to escape, but her back hit the wall and she froze there, trapped between it and the god looming before her. Waves of dark brown hair threaded with gold fell to caress his sun-kissed forehead as he leaned towards her. Her stomach twisted, heart laboring as she struggled for air, her entire body quaking, but not from fear. Something pressed down on her, some pressure in the air that made it impossible for her to move and sapped her strength, stealing it from her even as she fought to keep hold of it. Why? She whispered. Bright golden light flashed between them, and she screamed as fire blazed through her, devouring the last of her strength. She slumped into his waiting arms, and as she was fading into the darkness, she caught his answer to her question. I need to keep my promise. Chapter 24. Valen blocked the fist that flew at his face, catching it in his right hand, and grinned as he sent his lightning into it. The demon shrieked and struggled, writhing as he desperately tried to pull his hand free of Valen's unrelenting grip. It only made him pump more of his power into the wretch, driving him to his knees. He released the male when he slumped, going limp and hitting the dirt. Dead. 1 down, 5 to go. It seemed someone had arranged a party at the gate. He scanned the gathered males. A couple of shifters, one of a more demonic persuasion, and the other 2 he couldn't place from their scent. Might be bloodsuckers of some sort. They always had a muddled scent due to their disgusting feeding habits. A challenge, but one he would relish. The gate shimmered between them, the flat disc hovering a couple of feet above the dusty floor of the Stadio Palatino, the circles and glyphs slowly turning in opposite directions. The air hummed with its power, distracting him, but as much as he wanted to close it, it wouldn't happen while he was near it. He could close it if he focused, but he didn't think the demons would happily consent to giving him a couple of minutes to do so if he asked. The gate was the reason they were here, after all. They had been waiting for him, and the moment the gate had appeared, reacting to his presence, they had jumped him. He was pretty sure he had broken the arm of the fair-haired shifter. His friend hadn't fared so well. He looked down at the smoldering corpse and nudged it with his booted foot. The tension in the air grew thicker, warning him that the demons were gearing up for another go. He held his ground, showing no fear, no trace of doubt, even when he felt a trickle of both of those things. He had come to the gate unarmed and unprepared. Not his wisest move. But he had wanted to deal with it quickly and get back to Ava. He should have grabbed his knives as well as his amulet from the room he used as his armory. Damn it. Sense told him to back off and leave. Without him here, the gate was safe. He couldn't do that, though. It was his mission to protect it, and these demons had clearly been tampering with it because there sure as hell wasn't a fucking hellspawn waiting for passage, not on this side or the other. How the fuck had the demons made the gate call him? There wasn't a hellspawn among them. Was it possible there had been one, but the arrival of the demons had scared them off? It made a damn lot more sense than the alternative, that these demons had made the gate reach out to him. "We should make this quick," he said, his voice breaking the tense silence, and looked around the ancient site again. "The human security guards tend to get a little tetchy about me being here." He couldn't count the number of times one of them had tried to interfere, chasing him from the Palatine Hill as if he was a mere intruder, or someone looking to steal from the ruins. Really pissed him off, too. Sometimes he wished they could see the gate. At least then they would know why he was there. "We'll make it quick. Hand it over and you can go." The dark-haired one in the middle, Demon Boy, pointed to his chest. Valen frowned down at the amulet sitting against his black t-shirt, the silver portion of the black disc reflecting the colors of the gate as they shifted. They wanted his amulet. He laughed at that. Fuck no. He shoved his right foot into the dead demon and kicked hard, sending the corpse flying through the disc of the gate and into his friends. The gate blackened where the demon had passed through it, sparks of white erupting from it as it repaired itself. And then it was as if the interruption had never happened. The colors returned, and it continued to await his command. The 5 demons launched at him. Valen grinned and blocked every attack, moving faster than they could. 2 fell with ease, 1 shifter and 1 bloodsucker. Demon Boy managed to get close to touching his amulet in the fray, and he snarled as he snagged the bastard's wrist and twisted it hard, sending him slamming into the ground. The male grunted and rolled onto his side, and Valen stuck a boot in his gut, knocking the wind from him. The second bloodsucker used his distraction against him, slamming a fist into his right kidney and then bringing his arm up to loop it over Valen's. He pulled it back, hauling Valen away from Demon Boy, and Valen growled at him, flashing his own fangs. He shoved his left hand against the bloodsucker's pretty face and let rip. The male howled as lightning leaped from Valen's hand and into his head, and jerked backwards out of Valen's grip. He huffed and launched towards the wretch, unwilling to let him escape that easily. Demon Boy grabbed his ankle, sending him tipping forwards into a fall. Darkness swallowed him, and he appeared in the air above them, dropping out of it to land on his feet. Black ribbons caressed his skin, and he casually brushed them away as the 3 males stared at him. Valen lifted his right hand, pressed his index finger and thumb together, and clicked. A thick white-purple bolt of lightning shot from the sky. Bloodsucker number 2 barely had time to look up before it hit him, vaporizing him in an instant. Shifter number 2 ran. Pussy. Valen huffed as the demon disappeared into the night, slowly turned his focus to his opponent. And then there was one. "You want this?" He toyed with the amulet around his neck, lifting it from his chest and letting it sway from the chain, taunting the demon with it. "Want to go through the gate?" The male's eyes narrowed on him and blazed red, and horns curled from his forehead, the point sweeping back over his hair and then curving upwards. He growled and slowly lumbered onto his feet, his body growing, stretching his dark clothing tight. It ripped at the seams as he hit 7 foot, 8 foot, 9. Was the bastard going to stop? His skin darkened to burnished red, and he growled through huge canines. He held his hand out, his black talons glistening in the light of the gate coming from behind him. "Mine," he grunted and pointed to the amulet. A man of few words, at least when he was in his demonic form. Valen sighed. I'm afraid not. You see, I don't like to share. But if you promise to tell me who sent you here, I promise to send you through the gate."
His rough features pinched, and Valen figured he was thinking. Either that or he was taking a crap. He swayed the amulet again, capturing Demon Boy's attention with it. Longing filled his red eyes. He wanted to go through the gate, but did he want it badly enough to give up who had sent him? He wasn't sure. Demon Boy gave him his answer. He kicked off and thundered towards him, cloven feet plowing the dirt and shaking the ground. Very well. Valen stepped just as the male reached him, reappearing on the other side of him, and turned on his heel to track the wretch. He grinned and threw his left hand forwards, and lightning shot from it, 5 small bolts that twisted together to form one that struck the demon hard in his back and sent him flying across the ancient arena. The big brute landed hard and skidded, leaving a track in the dirt behind him. He was still for a moment, not even a heartbeat of time, and then pushed his hands into the earth and eased up onto his knees. Fuck. Valen had figured he would be just as weak as the others had been. It seemed he was stronger when his demonic side was unleashed. The male growled and launched into another charge. Valen easily dodged this one too, rolling to his left across the dusty ground and back onto his feet. It appeared the male was stronger, but his intelligence hadn't grown along with his body and that strength. Brute force wasn't going to claim him a victory here. Even if he had grown more intelligent, Valen still wouldn't have let him win. He had vowed to protect the gate, and he wouldn't fail in that mission. He was damned if he was going to put it at risk as Ares had. The demon ran at him again, shaking the ground, and unleashed a roar that echoed across Rome. Valen readied himself, calling his lightning, letting it flow through him and grow stronger, surrendering to it. His grin widened as it coursed through him, lit him up inside and sent a dark, addictive thrill through him. Demon Boy wasn't going to know what had hit him. A sharp pain shot down Valen's spine and he stiffened. His wards. Demon Boy slammed into him, sending him flying through the air, but he wasn't aware of it as one thought ricocheted around his head, mocking him. He was just like Ares after all, letting people break into his apartment while he was occupied. He grunted as his back slammed into solid stone, and the back of his head smacked off it a second later, the force of the blow sending stars spinning across his vision. "Fuck!" he snarled and lumbered onto his feet, clenched his jaw and growled at Demon Boy. Bastard would pay for managing to land that blow on him while he had been distracted. Much as he had been enjoying himself, he didn't have time to play anymore. He lifted his right hand to the sky. "Laters." Demon Boy looked up, frowned when no bolt of lightning came at him, screamed as it shot up from below him, running straight through his cloven feet and lighting him up. Valen frowned, made a few quick calculations to make sure it was enough juice to get the desired results, and stepped. Just as the demon exploded from the amount of electricity coursing through him, and a blackout rolled across Rome. Sometimes it was nice to mix things up. Lightning came from both earth and sky, after all, connecting somewhere in the middle. He landed hard in his apartment, that lightning chasing around his hands and crackling as it snaked up his arms, ready for his command. "Ava!" He hurried through the apartment, his lightning illuminating his path, and checked the bathroom first and then the bedrooms. Empty. He raced across the dark living room and into the kitchen. A pan of water on the stove boiled over and hissed. He turned it off and stared at it and the cutting board beside it. She had been making dinner. Had she gone out to get more ingredients? He hadn't told her that she couldn't leave the apartment, that it would cause the wards to trigger. He let out a long, slow breath to steady his pounding heart as his shoulders sagged, the tension draining from them, and flicked his hands, shaking his power from them as it settled. She must have gone out and triggered the wards. Gods. His chest hurt, and he rubbed it through his black t-shirt, trying to soothe the ache and the fear behind it. He didn't know what he would have done if someone had been in here, trying to take her from him, but it would have been bloody. He couldn't lose her. It hit him hard, almost knocking him onto his knees. He couldn't. Gods, it really would kill him. He walked back into the living room as the lights flickered back on, close to laughing at himself for panicking like that,
rushing to a rescue like some white knight. Idiot. He stilled as a familiar scent reached him through the sharp tang his power had left in the air. Lightning. Not his own. This was Zeus's brand. His heart stopped in his chest. The bastard had Ava.